Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell grabbed the night vision scope off the equipment table, popped the lens cap, and smashed the internal calibration pin against the edge of the steel rail before anyone could see. Then he smiled, wiped it clean, and set it back down with a little handwritten tag that read, Carter. "Let's see how the lady shoots blind," he muttered to the man beside him, and the two of them laughed like it was the funniest thing they had ever done. Before we go any further, I want to ask you one small favor. If stories about courage, about the underdog, nobody believed in about a woman who refused to be erased, mean something to you, then take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. Stay with me all the way to the end because you will not believe how this one turns out. And in the comments below, tell me the city you're watching from right now. I read every single one, and I love seeing just how far these stories travel. Now, let me tell you about Captain Emily Carter. The bus doors opened at Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake with a hiss that sounded almost like a warning, and the first person to step off wasn't what any of them expected. They'd been told a captain was coming. They'd been told she had credentials. What they hadn't been told, and what they clearly weren't ready for, was that she was a woman, that she was carrying a rifle case older than half the men standing there, and that she wasn't going to say a single word to defend herself. Emily Carter came down those 3 metal steps with a duffel over one shoulder and a long, scarred rifle case in her right hand, and she felt every eye land on her at once. She'd felt it before. She knew the weight of that kind of looking. It wasn't curiosity. It was judgment arriving before she'd even set both boots on the ground. "That's her," someone said, not quietly enough. "That's the captain everybody's been talking about. Somebody's daughter got lost on the way to the PX." Another voice answered, and a ripple of laughter moved through the crowd of the most lethal marksman the United States military had ever produced. Emily didn't turn her head. She didn't slow down. She walked toward the check-in station like she hadn't heard a thing, and that only seemed to bother them more. Behind the folding table sat Master Sergeant Elena Hendricks, a woman with 15 years in and eyes that missed nothing, and she watched Emily approach with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. She'd seen 100 shooters come through these doors. She'd seen swagger and she'd seen fear, and she'd learned the difference between the two. This one had neither. This one had something Hendricks couldn't name yet, and it made her sit up a little straighter. "Name," Hendricks said. "Carter, Emily Carter, Captain." Hendricks ran her finger down the roster, found the name, and paused. "You're the one who requested the manual qualification track. No electronic assist." "That's right. You know, nobody's run that track in 11 years. "I know." Hendricks looked up, and for just a moment, the two women held each other's gaze, and something passed between them that neither of them would have called respect yet, but that was headed in that direction. "Bay assignments on the sheet," Hendricks said. "Weapons check is at 0600, and Captain," she lowered her voice, "you're going to hear a lot of noise out here. Don't let it into your head." "It's already out of my head, Master Sergeant," Emily said. It was never really in it. And she walked away, leaving Hendricks to watch her go with the first genuine flicker of interest she'd felt all week. The barracks assignment put Emily in a bay with 11 men and a curtain that had been strung up in the corner. As an afterthought, the message loud and clear. She didn't complain. She set her duffel down, sat on the edge of the cot, unzipped the long case, and there it was. Her father's M14. Blued steel, worn silver at the edges where 40 years of hands had gripped it. A stock the color of dark honey, cracked once near the heel and repaired by a man who'd loved it too much to throw it away. She ran her thumb along a notch cut into the wood just above the trigger guard, a mark her father had made and never explained, and she felt her chest tighten the way it always did. "You're not seriously bringing that antique to a real competition." She looked up. A young man stood at the foot of her cot, crossed a smirk, already loaded and ready. Behind him, 3 others hovered, waiting for the show. "It shoots," Emily said simply. "It shoots?" he repeated, mocking the flatness of her voice. "Lady, we've got rifles out here that talk to satellites. We've got optics that do the math for you. Wine drop humidity, the whole deal. And you brought Grandpa's deer gun." He shook his head. "This isn't a museum. This is China Lake. Best shooters on earth. You're going to embarrass yourself." Emily closed the case with a quiet click. "What's your name?" "Kowalski, petty officer. Not that it matters, because after tomorrow, you'll be on a bus home." "Kowalski. She stood and she was shorter than him, and it didn't matter at all because when she stood, she took up more room than he did. I didn't come here to embarrass anybody, including you. But I'll tell you something my father told me, and you can do with it what you want. She paused. The rifle doesn't care who's laughing. She picked up her case and walked past him toward the door, and Kowalski's smirk faltered just enough that his buddies noticed, and one of them elbowed him, and the moment turned sour in a way none of them had planned for. Out on the range that first afternoon, the sun came down hard and flat, and the wind moved across the desert in long, invisible ropes that most men couldn't feel, but that Emily read like a page of a book she'd known since childhood. She stood at the edge of the observation area and watched the qualifying the shooters run their gear through pre-checks, and what she saw told her everything. They were good. There was no question. These were extraordinary marksmen, the kind of men who could put a round through a target the size of a coin at distances most people couldn't even see. But they leaned on their machines, every one of them. The ballistic computers, the laser rangefinders, the optics that painted the wind in colored lines across the glass. Take away the machine, she thought, and how many of them still know how to shoot? Enjoying the view, she turned. The man who'd spoken was tall, blonde, with the kind of face that had never had to work very hard for anything, and a lieutenant's bars and a way of standing that said he'd already decided how this conversation would go. Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell. She didn't know his name yet, but she knew the type down to the bone. Just watching, she said. That's what you should do, Mitchell said, and he said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. Watch, learn something, maybe write it down for the ladies back home. He smiled, because you're not going to last past qualification, and there's no shame in that. This is the top of the mountain, Captain. Not everybody's built for the altitude. You must be very good, Emily said. Emily. I'm the best here, Mitchell said without a flicker of hesitation. Ask anybody. 3 years running. So I'll tell you now, out of professional courtesy, when they hand you that busted scope tomorrow and your groups look like a shotgun spray, don't take it personal. It's just the way of things. And that was the mistake, that single sentence. Because Emily hadn't been told about any busted scope. Nobody had. Which meant Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell knew something about her equipment that he had no honest way of knowing. She didn't blink. She didn't let a single muscle in her face move. Thanks for the courtesy, Lieutenant, she said. That's very kind. And she filed it away, that one loose thread, and she tucked it somewhere safe, and she walked back toward the barracks with her father's rifle in her hand and a cold, clear certainty settling over her like a second skin. Somebody wanted her gone, and somebody had decided the way to do it was to make sure she couldn't see. That night, long after the bay had gone dark, and the other shooters had fallen into the deep breathing of men who slept easy, Emily sat cross-legged on her cot with a small red flashlight in her teeth, and her father's rifle laid across her knees, and she did the thing she'd done every night since she was 9 years old. She field-stripped it, blind, fingers moving on their own memory living in the joints of her hands, each piece coming apart and laying itself out in the dark exactly where it belonged. She was almost done when she heard the whisper. Can't sleep either, huh? She stopped. Across the bay, a shape sat up in the gloom. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Garza, 41 years old, 20 years of service, a man who'd stopped trying to prove anything to anybody a long time ago. He'd been watching her from the shadows, and she hadn't heard him wake, which almost never happened. Just cleaning, Emily said. You strip that rifle in the dark. Every night. Garza was quiet for a moment. My daddy used to make me do that. Lights off so I'd learn the weapon and not the picture of the weapon. He chuckled softly. I hated him for it. Then one night in a place I won't name it saved my life. He tilted his head. Where'd you learn my father? He military. Vietnam, staff sergeant, sniper. Emily's hands started moving again, reassembling the rifle piece by piece, and her voice went somewhere far away. He came home with this rifle in a box he never opened and a look in his eye he never lost. Taught me to shoot before he taught me to ride a bike. Said the world would try to take a lot of things from me because of what I am, but nobody could take a straight line between me and a target if I earned it fair. Garza sat with that for a long moment in the dark. He's still with us. No, Emily said. 6 years now. I'm sorry. Me too. The rifle came together in her hands with a series of soft, final clicks, and she set it beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then Garza spoke, and his voice had changed. It had lost the easy warmth and picked up something harder. Captain, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it the right way. He leaned forward. There's people out here who don't want you to compete. And I don't mean they'll say mean things at chow. I mean they've got a plan. I've been around long enough to smell it. Your gear's going to have problems tomorrow. Problems that don't happen by accident. I know, Emily said. Garza blinked. You know, somebody told me about a busted scope tonight. A scope I was never issued and never mentioned to anyone. She looked at him steady in the red light. So yeah, Chief, I know. Garza let out a long, slow breath. Then you're already ahead of most people, and that's the first good thing I've seen all week. He stood and he was a big man, and even in the dark, she could feel the weight of him deciding something. I'm not going to fix your fights for you. You didn't come here for that, and you wouldn't want it. But I'll tell you what I will do, King. I'll watch. And when they finally step wrong, and they will, I'll be standing right there when it happens. He nodded once. Get some sleep, Captain. Chief, Emily said as he turned. He looked back. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Garza said. Thank me when it's over, if either of us is still standing. Morning came gray and cold the way desert mornings do, and by 0600 the equipment bay was full of shooters running their weapons checks, and Emily stood at her assigned station with her father's M14 broken down in front of her when the range officer walked over and set a night vision scope on the table beside her. Standard issue for the low-light phase, Captain, the officer said, not meeting her eyes. You'll want to mount it and zero before the qualifier. Emily looked at the scope, then she looked at the officer. Then she picked the scope up, turned it over in her hands, and without a word, she pressed her thumbnail into the seam of the housing and felt the tiny telltale looseness of a calibration pin that had been snapped clean off its mount. Broken, just like Mitchell had promised. This one's damaged, she said loud enough for the shooters around her to hear. The officer's jaw tightened. That's your issued equipment, Captain, same as everyone else. It's not the same as everyone else, Emily said, and she said it calm and clear, and without a shred of anger which was somehow more powerful than if she'd screamed it. The internal pins sheared. This scope hasn't held a zero since somebody broke it on purpose. So I've got two choices. She set the scope down on the table gently like it was already dead. I can spend the next 4 hours fighting a piece of equipment that's designed to make me fail. Or I can do what I came here to do. And she reached down and she pulled her father's rifle back together and she left the scope sitting there untouched and she picked up the M14 with nothing but the iron sights her father had aimed through in the jungle 40 years before. The bay went quiet. You're going to run the whole qualifier on irons, someone said incredulous. That's crazy. Nobody shot iron sights competitively since my father did, Emily said. Since a lot of fathers did, back when the machine didn't do the thinking for you. She racked the bolt. Let's find out if it still works. Across the bay, Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell watched her walk toward the firing line, and for the first time, the easy smile on his face had a crack running through it because this was not the plan. The plan was that she'd fight the broken scope, get frustrated, blow her groups, wash out quietly, and disappear. The plan was not that she'd throw the scope in the trash and walk to the line like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this. She's bluffing, Mitchell muttered to Kowalski. Nobody hits anything on irons at these distances. She'll fold on the first stage. Yeah, Kowalski said, but he didn't sound so sure anymore. The first qualification stage was 300 yards, 10 rounds prone on a target the size of a dinner plate. For the men with optics, it was almost an insult. A warm-up, the kind of shot they could make half asleep. Emily settled behind the rifle and the range officer gave the command and the world got very small and very quiet. She didn't rush. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Every other shooter on the line was cracking off rounds at a steady rhythm, confident fast. Emily took her time. She breathed. She let the front sight post settle into the notch of the rear aperture. Let the target blur just slightly the way it's supposed to when your eye is where it belongs. And at the bottom of a long exhale, she pressed center. She cycled the bolt by hand, smooth and unhurried, and she pressed again. Center. Again, center. Down the line, the spotter watching her lane leaned into his scope, then leaned back, then leaned in again like he didn't trust what he was seeing. 10 for 10, he said, and his voice cracked on it. She's 10 for 10. Everyone in the black. Some of these are touching. That's not possible, someone said. On irons at 3. Go look for yourself, the spotter said. And a strange thing began to happen along that firing line. The laughter that had followed Emily Carter since she stepped off the bus started to die. Not all at once, in pieces. A smirk here that quietly folded. A whisper there that trailed off and didn't get finished. The men who'd had so much to say the day before found they had less and less to say with every round she sent down range. Because there is a kind of skill that shuts a room up all on its own, and Emily had it. And it was undeniable. Mitchell watched her 10-round string come off the target board, and the crack in his smile spread into something that wasn't a smile at all. Wind's gonna get her at 600, he said to nobody in particular. Nobody dopes wind on irons. It can't be done. But it could be done. Her father had done it in country where the wind changed 3 times between the muzzle and the man. And he'd taught her how standing behind her on a hill in Montana when she was 11 years old, his big hand on her small shoulder, his voice low and patient in her ear. Feel it on your face, Em. Feel it move the grass. The rifle can't tell you what the air is doing. Only you can. At 600 yards, Emily lay down behind her father's rifle and she took off her glove and she held her bare hand up for a moment, palm open to the desert, and she felt the wind push against her skin and she read it. And then she adjusted her hold, not her sights, her hold, and she pressed the trigger. And she hit. And she hit again. And again. And when the 600-yard string came off the board, the spotter didn't say anything at all for a long moment. And then he took his hat off, which is a thing that men do without deciding to. And he said very quietly, "That's the tightest group I've seen all week, from anybody." And she did it on iron sights in a 4-mile-an-hour crosswind. Master Sergeant Hendricks was standing at the back of the range with a clipboard, and she wrote something down, and then she looked up at Emily Carter, lying calm behind that old rifle, and she smiled the smallest smile you ever saw. By the end of the first day, Emily Carter had qualified in the top 3 of the entire competition, running iron sights against men with $100,000 of technology strapped to their weapons. And the barracks that night was a very different place than it had been 24 hours before. Nobody laughed when she walked in. Nobody had a joke ready. The curtain in the corner suddenly looked petty and small, and a couple of the men who'd hung it wouldn't meet her eye. There's a particular silence that falls over people who realize they've badly misjudged someone, and that silence hung in the bay thick as smoke. But not everyone had gone quiet in the same way. Emily was sitting on her cot cleaning her rifle when she noticed her spotting scope was gone. She'd left it in her gear bag zipped at the foot of the cot, and now the pocket was open and the scope was gone. She checked her ammunition next to match-grade rounds she'd hand-loaded herself, and half of them were missing. And then she reached for the folder where she kept her range cards and her training schedule, the notes in her father's handwriting that she'd carried for 6 years. And the folder was there, but the schedule was gone. Someone had gone through her things. Someone had taken exactly what would hurt her most. She sat very still for a long moment, and then Garza's voice came low from across the bay. "They took your stuff." It wasn't a question. Emily looked up. Garza was watching her and his jaw was set hard. "My spotting scope, half my match rounds, my father's range cards." Emily's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now, something cold and controlled and dangerous. "The schedule, too." "That's not a prank," Garza said. "That's a campaign." He stood and crossed the bay and crouched down beside her cot so they could speak low. "First the scope, now this. Somebody's escalating, Captain. And escalating means they're scared. You scared them today. You weren't supposed to make the cut, and you made the top 3, and now they're panicking. And panicking, men get sloppy." He looked at her hard. "Did you touch anything after you found it gone?" "No." "Good. Leave it. Let me get Hendricks. She's straight, and she doesn't like this kind of thing any more than I do." Garza paused. "You okay?" Emily looked down at her father's rifle in her lap, at the notch he'd cut in the stock that she still didn't understand at 40 years of a man's life worn into old steel and old wood. "They can take my spotting scope," she said quietly. "They can take my ammunition and my range cards and every piece of paper I own." She lifted her eyes to Garza's, and there was a fire in them now that hadn't been there before. "But they can't take what my father put in my hands. That's the one thing in this whole place they can't reach, and they don't even understand that yet." Garza looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, and when he stood up, his knees cracked and he said, "No, no, ma'am, I don't believe they do." What none of them knew, not Emily, not Garza, not Hendricks, was that in a locked office on the far side of the base, a man named Commander David Reeves had just pulled a personnel file, and he was sitting at his desk under a single lamp, with the file open in front of him, reading a name he hadn't expected to ever see again. Carter William, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, Vietnam. Reeves had been a young lieutenant once, 40 years back, and there was a story he'd heard as a green officer, a story about a sniper who'd held a position alone against impossible odds. So a column of wounded men could get out a story about a man who should have gotten the highest honor his country could give, and who got a form letter and a footnote instead, because the paperwork went one way and the truth went another, and somewhere in between, a good man got erased. He'd never known the sniper's name. It was just a story the kind old soldiers told to remind young ones what the job really cost. And now here it was in black and white in the file of a captain who'd walked onto his range and shot the eyes out of every target on it with a rifle from that very war. Reeves set the file down and rubbed his face with both hands, and he said out loud to the empty room, "My God, it's the same man, it's her father." He didn't know yet what he was going to do about it, but he knew he wasn't going to let it stay buried a second time. Not on his watch. Back in the bay, Master Sergeant Hendricks arrived with a flashlight and a hard look, and she went through Emily's gear with a professional's eye, and when she was done, she stood up and clicked the light off, and her face in the dim room was carved out of stone. "Chief's right," she said. "This is deliberate, and it's not one guy acting alone. To get into a secured bay, get past the duty log and pull specific items, that takes access. That takes somebody with a key and a reason." She looked at Emily. "Captain, I'm going to be straight with you, because you've earned straight. Somebody in the chain of command is either doing this or letting it happen. And that means the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you can't trust." "I understand," Emily said. "You don't seem surprised." "I stopped being surprised a long time ago, Master Sergeant." Emily set her cleaned rifle down. "You want to know the truth? I've spent my whole career being the only one in the room who looked like me. First to do this, only one to do that. And every single time there was a Kowalski and a Mitchell and a broken scope with my name on it. This isn't new, it's just louder here." Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say. "My first duty station, they had me making coffee and answering phones. Took me 4 years to get on a range. When I finally outshot the golden boy they had lined up for the slot, he cried. Grown man, cried, and then filed a complaint that I'd cheated." She shook her head at the memory. "So no, Captain, it's not new to me either." She held out her hand. "But it's going to be different this time, because this time you're not alone, and neither am I." Emily took her hand, and in that handshake in that quiet dark bay, full of sleeping men who'd underestimated her, something shifted. She'd walked off that bus alone. She wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell requested a private word with the competition director, and he made it sound like concern, and it was poison dressed up as duty. He suggested in the careful language of a man protecting himself that Captain Carter's scores seemed statistically improbable, that perhaps there ought to be an inquiry, that a woman shooting those numbers on iron sights strained credibility and might reflect poorly on the integrity of the whole event if it went unexamined. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Mitchell said, spreading his hands, the picture of reasonableness. "I'm just saying we owe it to the other competitors to make sure everything's on the level. That's all, for the good of the competition." The director, a careful man who valued his career, nodded slowly and said he'd consider it. And Mitchell walked out of that office satisfied that he'd planted a seed that would grow into exactly the doubt he needed. What he didn't know was that Chief Garza had been standing in the corridor outside cleaning his weapon on a bench close enough to hear every word through the half-open door. And what he didn't know was that Garza had a very long memory and a very short tolerance for men who stabbed in the dark. Garza found Emily on the range during the midday break, sighting her rifle, and he sat down beside her without a word and waited until she'd finished her string before he spoke. "Mitchell went to the director," he said, "wants an inquiry into your scores. Says they're too good to be real." Emily didn't look up. She was watching a target 400 yards downrange with her naked eye. "Of course he does. You're not mad. Being mad is what he wants, Chief. Mad makes you shoot high." She finally turned to look at him. Let him have his inquiry. Let him bring every expert he wants. You know what happens when they put me under a microscope? They see the same thing everybody else has seen for 2 days. A straight line between me and a target. She looked back downrange. The truth is the only thing in this world that gets stronger the harder you push on it. My father taught me that too. Garza looked at her, and then he laughed low and genuine, the first real laugh she'd heard from him. You know, Captain, I came out here to warn you, and instead I'm sitting here getting a lesson. Your daddy must have been a hell of a man. He was, Emily said softly. He really was. And she didn't know it, but 200 yards behind her, standing in the shadow of the observation tower, Commander David Reeves was watching her shoot, watching the way she read the wind with her bare hand, watching the ghost of a Vietnam sniper move in the hands of his daughter, 40 years and half a world away from where the story began. And Reeves felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Something like the closing of a circle, something like justice finally starting to turn. He didn't approach her. Not yet. What he had to do had to be done carefully with the right documents and the right witnesses, because the same system that had buried William Carter the first time would fight like hell to keep him buried, and Reeves intended to win. That afternoon, the range officer posted the standings for the next phase, and Captain Emily Carter's name sat in the top 3, and beside it, in a column that hadn't been used in over a decade, were the 2 words that had already become a kind of legend around the base: iron sights. Kowalski stood in front of the board reading it, and Emily walked up beside him, and for a moment the two of them just looked at the standings together in silence. I owe you an apology, Kowalski said finally. He didn't look at her, he looked at the board. I said some things, off that bus, about the deer gun. He swallowed. I was wrong. I've been shooting my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what you did out there yesterday. Not on the best day I ever had. Emily was quiet for a moment. You know why I use the irons, she said. It's not to prove a point. It's because when you take away the machine, there's nowhere to hide. It's just you and the rifle and the truth. The wind's real, the distance is real, your heartbeat's real, and there's no computer to blame if you miss. She looked at him. My father used to say, the scope will lie to you if you let it. It'll tell you you're a better shooter than you are. But the irons never lie. They give you exactly what you earned, nothing more. Kowalski nodded slowly. That's a hard way to live. It's the only way I know, Emily said. And she meant more than shooting, and Kowalski understood that she meant more than shooting, and something passed between them, the mocker and the mocked, that turned into the first crack of a genuine respect. But not everyone was cracking toward respect. Because that same evening in a maintenance building on the edge of the range complex, a logistics officer doing a routine inventory found something that didn't belong. A key. A logistics access key that opened secured storage and equipment bays across the competition site. And the tag on the key, the small metal identifier, stamped with an assignment code traced back to one locker. Locker 14, Captain Emily Carter's locker. The logistics officer stood there holding the key, and his stomach dropped because he understood immediately what it looked like. It looked like Emily Carter had been sneaking into restricted areas. It looked like the woman with the suspiciously perfect scores had access to places she had no business being. It looked, in other words, exactly like what somebody had gone to a great deal of trouble to make it look like. He reported it up the chain as he was required to do, and by the time the sun went down, the whisper had started moving through the base, and this whisper was worse than any that had come before. This one had teeth. This one could end a career and maybe worse. Did you hear they found a master key in Carter's locker? She's been getting into the secured bays. That's how she's been shooting those scores. She's been cheating the whole time. Garza heard it at the chow hall and set his tray down so hard it cracked. Hendricks heard it in the admin office and went white with fury. And Emily heard it from Garza, who found her in the barracks and told her straight because she'd earned straight, and she listened without a word until he was finished. Then she said very quietly, a logistics key in my locker that I've never touched, in a lock I never opened that opens rooms I've never been in. That's what they're saying. And who found it? Logistics officer, during inventory, says it was just sitting there. Emily was silent for a long moment, and then slowly she began to smile, and it was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter who has just seen the trap her prey has laid and understood in one clean instant that the prey has made a fatal mistake. Chief, she said, they just made their first real error. Garza frowned. How do you figure this looks bad? This looks real bad. It looks bad because it's supposed to look bad, but think about it. Emily stood up and the fire was back in her eyes, brighter than ever. That key opens the secured bays. The same secured bays that somebody got into to steal my scope and my ammunition and my father's range cards. They needed a key to do that, and now they've planted the key in my locker to frame me for cheating. She looked at Garza. Do you see it? And Garza saw it. Slowly then, all at once he saw it, and his face split into a hard grin. They planted the murder weapon, he said. They planted the exact tool that was used to sabotage you in your locker to make you look guilty. But that key doesn't just prove you had access. His grin widened. It proves somebody had access. It proves the sabotage was real. It's the first piece of physical evidence that any of this ever happened. That's right, Emily said. For 2 days, it's been my word against theirs. Whispers and broken scopes and missing gear I couldn't prove. But now, she held up one finger. Now there's a physical object, a key with a tag and an assignment code. And keys have records, Chief. Somebody had to check that key out. Somebody had to sign for it. And whoever signed for it thought they were framing me, but what they really did was leave their name in a logbook. Garza stared at her, and then he started to laugh, that low, genuine laugh again, and he shook his head in something close to wonder. You are not what they thought you were, he said. Not even a little bit. They thought they were up against a woman who'd cry and quit. And instead, they walked into a sniper who's been reading wind since she was 11 years old and doesn't miss a thing. He stood up. I got to get to Hendricks. And she's going to want to pull those logistics records before somebody smart enough to be scared makes them disappear. Go, Emily said. And Chief moved fast, because right now, somewhere on this base, there's a man who thinks he just won, and a man who thinks he's won stops watching his back. Garza was already moving. And across the base in his lamp-lit office, Commander Reeves closed the personnel file of Staff Sergeant William Carter, and he picked up his phone and he made a call to an old friend in the Army's Awards and Decorations branch, a call 40 years overdue. And when the man on the other end answered, Reeves said only, I need you to pull a Vietnam-era file for me, a recommendation that got buried, and I need you to tell me who buried it. And in the barracks alone now, Emily Carter picked up her father's rifle and ran her thumb one more time along that notch cut into the honey-colored stock the mark he'd made and never explained. And for the first time in 6 years, sitting in the dark on an enemy's ground with the whole system arrayed against her, she felt like she finally understood a little of what he'd carried, what it was to do everything right and be told it wasn't enough, what it was to shoot straight and true and have the world decide for reasons that had nothing to do with the target that you didn't belong on the line. They took your recognition, Daddy, she whispered to the old steel in her hands. They tried to erase you, and they're trying to do the same thing to me right now, tonight in this room. She raised the rifle and she sighted through the irons at a knot in the far wall, and she let her breathing slow, the way he'd taught her, in and out long, and even until her heartbeat was the only clock in the room. But I'm not going anywhere, she said. And neither are you, not this time, not ever again. And somewhere out in the dark, the wind moved across the desert in long, invisible ropes. The same wind she'd read that morning with her bare hand, the same wind her father had read in a jungle a lifetime ago, carrying the same truth it had always carried, patient and certain and impossible to lie to. The rifle doesn't care who's laughing. And Emily Carter, Captain, United States military, daughter of a buried hero. The woman they'd tried to erase before she ever fired a shot, lowered the rifle and set it gently across her knees and waited for morning with the calm of someone who has finally completely stopped being afraid. Because they'd made their move, and now it was her turn. Morning came before the logbook did. Master Sergeant Hendricks was standing outside the logistics office at 520 minutes before it opened, coffee going cold in her hand, when the duty clerk arrived and found her there, and knew instantly that his day was about to get very complicated. I need the checkout records for every logistics access key on this base, Hendricks said. Last 72 hours, and I need them before anyone else touches that computer. The clerk was young and he was nervous, and he made the mistake of hesitating. Master Sergeant, I'd need authorization from... You'd need authorization to refuse me, Hendricks said, and she stepped in close enough that the priest could count the ribbons on her chest. Son, there's a captain in this competition getting framed for something she didn't do, and the evidence that clears her is sitting in that database right now. And every minute you stall, somebody with more access than you is deciding whether to delete it. So you can hand me those records, or you can explain to a board of inquiry why you were the last man standing between the truth and the shredder. Your choice. The clerk handed her the records, and Hendricks started reading, and her jaw got tighter with every line, because the story the logbook told was not the story anyone was whispering in the chow hall. The logistics key found in Emily Carter's locker had a serial number, and that serial number had been checked out 4 days ago before Emily Carter ever stepped off the bus by an equipment manager named Sergeant First Class Dale Pruitt. And Sergeant Pruitt had not returned it, and Sergeant Pruitt Hendricks knew ran the maintenance building on the edge of the range complex. The same building where the scope had come from. The same building that stored the ammunition. Gotcha, she said out loud alone in that office. You careless son of a gun, you gotcha. She photographed every page twice on 2 different devices, and she emailed 1 copy to herself and 1 to Chief Garza, and 1 to an account she kept off base for exactly this kind of moment, because Hendricks had been in the Navy 15 years, and she had learned the hard way that evidence has a way of vanishing when it embarrasses the wrong people. Then she went to find Emily. She found her on the range, of course. Where else would she be? Emily was already at her station, already sighted, and already 10 rounds into a warm-up string that a spotter 40 yards away was watching with the slack-jawed expression that had become permanent on the faces of everyone who watched Emily Carter shoot. Captain Hendricks said, "We need to talk, now." Emily cleared her rifle, set it down, and stood. "You found something. The key's real, and it doesn't point where they wanted it to point." Hendricks held up her phone. "It was checked out 4 days before you got here by a Sergeant Pruitt, equipment manager, runs the maintenance shed, never signed it back in, which means the key that's supposed to prove you were sneaking around actually proves you couldn't have been, because you weren't even on this base when it went missing." For a moment, Emily didn't react at all. And then she closed her eyes and she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for 2 days, and when she opened them again, there was something in them that Hendricks hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly, something harder. "Pruitt," Emily said. "I don't know the name." "You wouldn't. He's a nobody, a pay grade and a set of keys." Hendricks lowered the phone, which is exactly why they used him. "Nobody plans a frame job and puts their own name on the paperwork, Captain. Pruitt didn't do this because he woke up hating you. Somebody told him to. Somebody with rank." "Mitchell," Emily said. "Maybe, probably, but maybe isn't enough. A logbook proves the key went missing. It doesn't prove who told Pruitt to use it, and it doesn't put anybody's hand in your locker." Hendricks shook her head. "We've got the tool. We don't have the man. Not yet." And that was the thing about hope, Emily thought. It came in with the tide, and it went out just as fast. For about 90 seconds, she'd let herself believe it was over. And now she understood it was just beginning. "Then we get the man," she said. 14 minutes later, Chief Garza was standing in the maintenance shed on the edge of the range complex, leaning against a workbench, with his arms crossed, watching Sergeant First Class Dale Pruitt sweat. Pruitt was a soft man with a soft handshake and eyes that couldn't stay still. And he was very bad at lying, which was the only lucky thing that had happened to Emily Carter in 3 days. "I don't know what you're talking about," Pruitt said for the 3rd time, and each time he said it, he sounded less sure. "Sure you do," Garza said easily. "Key number 4471. Checked out under your name last Tuesday. Never came back." He let that sit. "And this morning it turns up in a captain's locker. Funny coincidence, huh? Key you signed for in a locker. You had a master to framing a woman you've never met." He tilted his head. "That's a lot of coincidences for one little key, Dale." "I lost it," Pruitt said. "I lost the key. Keys get lost. That's not a crime." "No," Garza agreed. "Losing a key's not a crime, but you know what is tampering with competition equipment, planting evidence, conspiracy to defraud a federal event." He pushed off the bench and walked slow toward Pruitt, not threatening, just closing space the way you'd walk toward a spooked animal. "See, here's what I know. I know that scope came out of this shed. I know the ammunition came out of this shed. And I know you're the only man with the keys to this shed. So either you did all of it yourself alone for no reason, and you're going to eat the whole thing by yourself, or Garza stopped a foot away. Or somebody told you to, and you were dumb enough to say yes. And now that somebody's sitting pretty while you're standing here in a puddle of your own sweat, waiting to take the fall alone. Pruitt's mouth opened and closed and opened again. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds, Garza said quietly, to decide whether you're a fall guy or a witness. Because those are the only two doors left in this room and one of them locks behind you. And Dale Pruitt, who was soft and scared and in far, far over his head, broke. It wasn't my idea, he blurted. None of it. I swear to God, Chief, I never wanted any part of this. He came to me, said it was just a prank, said the woman didn't belong here, and it'd be funny to knock her down a peg. Said it was just a scope, no big deal, and then it was the ammo, and then he stopped shaking. By the time it was the locker, I knew it wasn't a prank anymore, but by then I was already in it. What was I supposed to do? Who, Garza said, just the one word. Pruitt swallowed. If I say the name, what happens to me? That depends on what else you're willing to say, and how loud you're willing to say it, and whether you'll put your name on it. Garza's voice didn't change. But I'll tell you what happens if you don't say it. You go down alone. That's not a threat, Dale. That's just arithmetic. Now, who told you to plant that key? And Pruitt said the name, and it was not the name anyone expected. Reeves, Pruitt whispered. Commander Reeves. Garza went very still. For a full 3 seconds, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't so much as breathe because that name did not fit. It did not fit anywhere. Commander David Reeves was the one man on this base who had quietly and behind the scenes been pulling files and making calls to help Emily Carter. Garza knew it because Hendricks had told him that morning that Reeves had been seen requesting the William Carter personnel file, that Reeves was digging into the old buried recommendation. Reeves was supposed to be on their side. Say that again, Garza said slowly. Commander Peeves, Pruitt repeated, and now the words were tumbling out of him, desperate, a man trying to save himself. He came to me 4 days ago, before she even got here. Said there was a captain coming who was going to cause problems, and it was in everybody's interest to make sure she didn't make it far. Gave me instructions. The scope, the timing, all of it. I've got a text. I saved it in case. He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands. In case something like this happened. I'm not going down for an officer. I've got it right here. And he held up the phone, and there it was. A message. From a saved contact labeled with a name and a rank, and the name was Reeves. Garza took the phone. He read the message twice, and a cold, sick feeling settled into his gut because if this was real, then everything they thought they knew was wrong, and the man Emily had been quietly trusting was the man who'd been trying to destroy her from before she ever arrived. Don't move, Garza told Pruitt. Don't call anybody. Don't so much as go to the bathroom. You understand me? You just became the most important witness on this base, and I need you exactly where I can find you. He walked out of the shed with Pruitt's phone in his hand, and he called Hendricks, and when she picked up, he said 4 words that made her stop cold in the middle of the range. It's Reeves. It was Reeves. 22 minutes later, the three of them, Garza, Hendricks, and Emily, stood in the empty ammunition storage room where nobody would overhear, and Garza laid it out and watched the news land on Emily's face like a physical blow. That's not possible, Emily said. Reeves has been helping me. He pulled my father's file. He's been trying to fix a 40-year-old injustice. Why would the same man plant a key in my locker? I don't know, Garza admitted. It doesn't add up. But I've got a text on Pruitt's phone from a contact saved as Reeves giving him the orders, and I've got Pruitt swearing on his life. It was Reeves who came to him. That's not nothing, Captain. That's a witness and a document. It's too clean, Hendricks said suddenly. They both looked at her. Think about it, she said, pacing now, working it out loud. 3 days of sabotage, and the guy behind it is a ghost. No name, no face, careful as hell. The scope we couldn't prove, the theft we couldn't prove. The whole thing's been surgical. And then all of a sudden, the fall guy just happens to have a saved text message with the mastermind's full name and rank on it. Conveniently kept, conveniently produced the second we lean on him. She stopped pacing. That's not how careful people work. Careful people don't text orders, and they sure as hell don't let a soft-headed equipment sergeant keep the receipt. The room went quiet. You think the text is fake? Emily said slowly. I think somebody wanted us to find that text, Hendricks said. I think somebody knew we'd squeeze Pruitt, and I think they set it up so that when Pruitt broke, he'd hand us the wrong name. A name that would blow up the one man on this base who's actually trying to help you. She looked at Emily hard. Whoever's really running this is a lot smarter than Pruitt, and a lot smarter than we've been giving them credit for. They're not just trying to knock you out of a competition anymore, Captain. They're trying to burn down everyone standing next to you, and if we go marching to the director accusing Reeves off a fake text, we do their job for them and we take out our own ally and hand them the win. Emily was silent for a long time, and then she said very quietly, "How do we know the text is fake?" "We don't," Hendricks said. "That's the trap. It might be real. Reeves might be playing a very deep game, helping you with one hand and cutting you with the other. Or the text might be planted and Reeves might be exactly what he seems. And we cannot tell which from inside this room, which means we can't move on it. Not yet. Not until we know." And there it was, the perfect trap. Because if they trusted Reeves and he was guilty, he'd destroy them. And if they turned on Reeves and he was innocent, they'd destroy their only real ally with their own hands. Every path forward was a landmine, and somebody had laid every one of them on purpose. "Then I go to Reeves myself," Emily said. "Absolutely not," Garza said. "If he's dirty, you walk right into the lion's den and tell him everything we know. And if he's clean," Emily said, "he's the only man with the rank to actually stop this. And every hour we sit here not trusting him is an hour the real enemy uses to bury us deeper." She looked at both of them. "You said it yourself, Master Sergeant. We can't tell from inside this room. So I'm going to go into a room with the man and find out. Because I can read a target at 600 yards in a crosswind. I can read a man across a desk." "Captain," Garza started, "my father spent his whole life having decisions made about him by people in rooms he wasn't allowed into," Emily said, and her voice cut clean through the objection. "They buried him with paperwork. They decided what he was worth without ever looking him in the eye. I'm not doing this from the outside. I'm going to sit down across from David Reeves, and I'm going to look him in the eye, and I'm going to know. And then we'll move." There was no arguing with it. Garza knew it, and Hendricks knew it, and after a long moment they both nodded, because there are people you can talk out of things, and there are people you can't, and Emily Carter had stopped being the kind you could talk out of anything the moment she walked off that bus. But she never got the chance to pick the moment, because the moment came for her. 50 minutes later, a runner found Emily on the range with a summons. Commander Reeves wanted to see her. In his office. Immediately. Garza's face went gray when she told him. "He knows," he said. "Somehow he knows we squeezed Pruitt. He's calling you in to get ahead of it." Or, Emily said, picking up her rifle case because she wasn't going anywhere without it. "He's calling me in about my father's file exactly like an innocent man would." She snapped the case shut. "I'll know in 5 minutes. Keep Pruitt where he is. And Chief, if I'm not out of that office in half an hour, come get me." She walked across the base alone, the way she'd walked off the bus alone, and she knocked on the door of Commander David Reeves' office, and a voice inside said, "Come in." And she went in and she closed the door behind her, and she looked the man in the eye. Reeves was in his 50s, weathered gray at the temples, with the kind of tired, honest face that could be a mask or could be the truth, and Emily had come here to tell the difference. On his desk sat a file, a thick, old, dog-eared file, and Emily's eyes went to it before she could stop them, because she recognized the name typed on the tab even upside down and across a room. Carter William. "Captain Carter," Reeves said. "Sit down, please." And then before she'd even taken the chair, before she'd said a single word, he said the thing that changed everything. "I owe your father an apology 40 years overdue, and I owe you the truth. Both of you, right now." Emily sat down slowly. "You knew my father." "No," Reeves said. "I never met him, but I heard about him once when I was a Green Lieutenant, and I never forgot the story, and I never knew it was him until 3 days ago when your name crossed my desk and I pulled this." He put his hand flat on the file. "Do you know what your father did in Vietnam?" "Captain, the whole of it." "He was a sniper," Emily said carefully. "He came home with a box he never opened and a look in his eye he never lost. He didn't talk about it. Ever." "No," Reeves said softly. "No men like him usually don't." He opened the file and he turned it around so she could read it, and he slid it across the desk. In March of 1969, A column of wounded men was trapped in a valley with the enemy closing in from the high ground. They had one chance to get out, and it depended on somebody holding a ridge alone long enough for them to move. One man volunteered. He held that ridge for 11 hours, alone. Ran out of ammunition twice and got resupplied by a runner who nearly died bringing it to him. Kept the enemy off that column until every single wounded man was clear. 41 men, Captain. 41 men went home to their families because one man decided he wasn't going to leave that ridge. Emily's hands had gone very still on the edge of the desk. His commanding officer put him in for the Medal of Honor, Reeves went on, the highest award this country can give. The paperwork went up the chain, and somewhere along that chain, it disappeared. He tapped the file. Not denied. Denied leaves a record. It disappeared. The recommendation got separated from the sworn statements. The statements got filed under the wrong action, and by the time anyone might have noticed, the officer who'd witnessed it was dead, and the war was winding down, and nobody had the appetite to go digging. Your father got a letter thanking him for his service, and a footnote in a report nobody ever read. Reeves looked up, and his eyes were wet. He held a ridge for 11 hours and saved 41 lives, and his country gave him a footnote. Emily could not speak. She looked down at the file, at the sworn statements, at the words 11 hours and 41 men, and volunteered, and she thought of the notch her father had cut into the stock of his rifle and never explained the mark she'd run her thumb over 10,000 times, and she understood suddenly and completely what it was. It was a count, or a marker, or a wound. She would never know exactly. But she knew it was that ridge. She knew it was those 11 hours. She knew her father had carried that valley in the wood of his rifle for the rest of his life and had never, not once, told his daughter why. "Why are you showing me this?" she said, and her voice was not steady anymore. "Because I've spent 3 days trying to figure out how to fix a 40-year-old crime," Reeves said, "and because I need your help to do it. The evidence is here, but it's incomplete. I need the original recommendation, the one that disappeared, and I have reason to believe it still exists in an archive in St. Louis. I've requested it. It could take months, but there's something else." He leaned forward. "There's a witness, a runner. The man who resupplied your father on that ridge. He's still alive, Captain. He's 81 years old and he lives in Arizona, and he has never stopped telling the story of the sniper who held the line. If I can get his sworn statement to go with the file, we can reopen the recommendation. We can finish what your father's commanding officer started 40 years ago." He looked at her. "I can get your father his medal, but I can't do it without you." And Emily Carter, who had come into this room to read a man and decide if he was an enemy, understood in that moment with total certainty that David Reeves was no enemy. No man fakes that. No man sits with a 40-year-old file and weeps over a stranger's father to set a trap. She had come to read him, and she'd read him, and the answer was as clear as a target at 300 yards in still air, which meant the text on Pruitt's phone was a lie, which meant somebody had used David Reeves' name to try to blow up the one man who could give her father justice, which meant the real enemy knew about her father, knew about the file, knew about Reeves, knew enough to weaponize all of it. "Commander," Emily said slowly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." And she told him everything. The scope, the theft, the key in her locker, Pruitt breaking in the shed, and the text on Pruitt's phone with his name on it. She watched his face the whole time, and she watched it move from confusion to disbelief to something cold and furious. "Somebody used my name," Reeves said when she was done. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Somebody put my name on that man's phone to make you turn on me." "Yes, to stop your father's file." "I think so," Emily said. "I think whoever this is doesn't just want me out of the competition anymore. I think they found out what you're doing. I think they want to bury my father a second time, and they want to bury you with him for trying to dig him up. And the fastest way to do all of it was to make me think you were the enemy. If I'd walked in here today and accused you, if I'd gone to the director with that text, you'd be relieved of command by tonight. The file would be frozen. The whole thing would collapse, and they'd have done it with my own hands." Reeves sat back in his chair, and he looked at her, and something like awe moved across his tired face. "You knew the text might point here. You knew it might be a trap, and you walked into my office anyway alone to look me in the eye and find out for yourself." "I read Win for a living, Commander," Emily said. "I can read a man." And Reeves laughed one short, disbelieving breath, and then his face hardened all the way through. Then let's find out whose name should have been on that phone, because whoever it is, they've just made a very serious mistake. They put my name on a crime, and I take that personally. He stood up. Captain, as of this moment, this is no longer your fight alone. You have a commander. Do you understand me? You are not standing on that range by yourself anymore. Now walk me through the timeline. Every piece, from the bus forward. Down the hall at that exact moment, Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell was learning that his plan had gone wrong. He'd learned it from a friend in logistics who'd mentioned casually that Hendricks had pulled the key records at dawn, and that Garza had spent 40 minutes in the maintenance shed with Pruitt, and that Pruitt had come out white as a sheet and hadn't left his post since. Mitchell had gone very quiet at that news, and then he'd walk quickly to a place where he could make a phone call nobody would hear. Because Ryan Mitchell was not the top of the pyramid. He never had been. He was the man on the range, the ego, the golden boy who'd hated Emily Carter on sight and had been happy to make her miserable. But the scope, the theft, the key, the fake text, the reach into a 40-year-old file that was beyond Mitchell. That took access Mitchell didn't have and information Mitchell couldn't get. Mitchell was working for somebody, and when his call connected and a voice on the other end said his name, Mitchell said low and scared, "It's coming apart. They squeezed Pruitt. They've got the key records. If Pruitt talks, he's got the text, and the text has Reeves' name on it, and if they check that text against Reeves and it doesn't hold up, they're going to start pulling the thread, and the thread comes back to Pruitt," the voice on the other end said, calm and cold. "Only to Pruitt. That's why we used him. You knew that going in. And if Pruitt gives them me, then you deny it, and it's his word against yours, an equipment sergeant against a decorated lieutenant, and you win that every day of the week." A pause. "You're not calling me because you're worried about Pruitt, Ryan. You're calling me because you're worried about yourself. So let me remind you of something. You came to me. You wanted her gone. I gave you the means. Everything you did with your own hands and your own reasons. And there's not one shred of paper anywhere that connects any of it to me. So if you're thinking about getting cute about walking into the director's office and cutting a deal, understand that the only man who falls in that room is you." Another pause. "Now, hold your nerve. The competition's not over. She still has to shoot the final phase, and a lot can happen to a shooter in a storm." The line went dead, and Ryan Mitchell stood there with a dead phone in his hand and understood for the first time that he was not the hunter in this. He never had been. He was a tool the same as Pruitt, just a better dressed one. And the man on the other end of that phone had just told him without saying it directly that there was one more play left, and it was going to happen during the final phase, and it was going to happen to Emily Carter, and Mitchell was going to be part of it, whether he liked it or not. He thought about walking away. For about 4 seconds, he thought about walking into the director's office and telling the whole truth and taking his punishment and being done with it. And then he thought about what he'd lose: the reputation, the 3-year title, the career. And Ryan Mitchell, who was a coward in exactly the way that men who bully the weak are always cowards, chose the same thing. He'd been choosing his whole life. He chose himself. He put the phone away and he fixed his face into the confident smile he wore like a uniform, and he walked back toward the range as though nothing at all were wrong. But something was wrong with him now, and Chief Garza saw it the second he laid eyes on the man. Garza had spent 20 years reading people, and there is a specific look a man gets when he's just been told he's in too deep to get out: a particular tightness around the eyes, a stiffness in the walk, and Mitchell was wearing all of it under that easy grin. Garza said nothing. He just watched. And he filed it away next to the busted scope and the missing ammunition and the key in the locker, one more thread in a knot that was finally starting to come loose. That afternoon, the competition director called an all-hands briefing, and every shooter and instructor and official gathered in the assembly hall, and the director stood at the front and delivered the news that the final phase was going to be different this year. "Weather Command is tracking a major system moving in off the Pacific," the director said. "Big one. It's going to hit us during the final phase, and the brass has made the decision that we're going to shoot through it. That's not cruelty. That's the point. Any marksman can put rounds on target on a clear day with good glass. We want to know who can still do the job when the sky falls in. Wind, rain, low visibility, degraded optics. Electronic systems will be unreliable. Some of them will fail entirely." He paused. "This is the phase that separates the shooters from the technicians, and it starts in 36 hours. A murmur went through the hall. Men who'd built their entire careers on top-of-the-line optics and ballistic computers were suddenly looking at each other with the beginnings of real doubt, because a scope that fogs over is worse than no scope at all, and a computer that dies mid-string leaves a man holding a rifle he suddenly doesn't know how to aim. And in the middle of that murmuring, uncertain crowd, one shooter sat perfectly still and perfectly calm, and a slow understanding spread across the faces of the men around her as they realized what the storm meant for Captain Emily Carter. Because Emily didn't have optics to fog. She didn't have a computer to die. She had iron sights and a bare hand to read the wind, and a lifetime of shooting blind in the dark taught to her by a man who'd held a ridge for 11 hours in a jungle where nothing electronic could be trusted. The storm that was going to cripple every other shooter on that range was going to leave Emily Carter completely terrifyingly untouched. Kowalski, sitting 2 rows over, leaned toward the man next to him and said loud enough for a dozen people to hear, "You know who just won this competition, right? The storm just handed it to the one person who doesn't need the sun." And a lot of heads turned toward Emily Carter, and a lot of expressions that had started as mockery 3 days ago finished in that moment as something that looked a great deal like fear. But Emily wasn't thinking about winning. She was thinking about the phone call she couldn't hear, the one she knew in her bones had to be happening somewhere, because the frame job had failed and the fake text was going to fall apart the second anyone checked it. And cornered enemies don't quit. They escalate. In a storm that degraded every safety system on the range, that killed communications and dropped visibility to nothing and turned the whole complex into chaos, was not just a test. It was an opportunity. "They were going to try something during the storm," Emily said quietly that night to Garza and Hendricks and Reeves, the 4 of them gathered in Reeves' office with the door locked and the blinds drawn. "The frame failed. They know it's failing. And now there's a 36-hour clock running down to a phase where nobody can see anything and nothing works right. If I were them, that's exactly when I'd make my last move." "What kind of move?" Reeves said. "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But think about what a storm gives them. No visibility, no reliable comms, chaos on the range, equipment failing all around. If something happened to a shooter out there, an accident, a fall, a weapon malfunction, who's to say it was anything but the weather?" She let that sit. "They don't need me disqualified anymore. That ship sailed. Now they just need me to not finish. And the storm gives them the perfect cover to make sure I don't." The room was silent. "Then we don't let you shoot alone," Garza said flatly. "I'll be on that range with you. So will Hendricks, every second." "You can't," Emily said. "The final phase is individual and isolated. That's the whole point. Each shooter runs their lane away with a single range officer. No spotters, no support, just the shooter, the storm, and the target." She looked around the room. "They designed it that way to test us, and the enemy's going to use it against me. I'm going to be out there alone in a storm with no comms, and somebody's going to try to make sure I don't come back." "Then we get you a range officer we trust," Reeves said. "I assign the lane officers. I can put my own man on your lane. Somebody who won't leave your side and won't look the other way. And if the man they've got is smart," Hendricks said slowly, "they'll have already thought of that. They'll try to get their own officer on her lane. The assignment's going to be a fight, and it's going to happen in the paperwork quietly before the storm ever hits." She looked at Reeves. "Commander, whoever's running this has access to logistics, to competition records, to a 40-year-old personnel file. That's not a lieutenant. That's not Mitchell. Mitchell's a tool, same as Pruitt. Whoever's really behind this sits high enough to move the pieces from the shadows and never get his hands dirty." She paused. "Which means the fight over who stands next to Emily in that storm is a fight against somebody who might outrank you." And there it was, the thing none of them had wanted to say out loud. The enemy wasn't beneath them in the chain of command. The enemy might be above them. And in a military structure built entirely on the idea that rank is obeyed, an enemy with rank is an enemy who can move you, silence you, reassign you, and make it all look like nothing but the normal turning of the machine. Reeves stood up slowly, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the dark range where in 36 hours a storm was going to come down, and a woman was going to have to stand alone. "When I was a young officer," he said without turning around, "I watched the system swallow a hero. William Carter held a ridge for 11 hours and the machine erased him, and I told myself I was too junior to do anything about it, and I let it happen, and I've carried that for 40 years. He turned around and his tired face had gone hard as flint. I am not going to stand here and watch it happen to his daughter. Not again. Not while I've got the rank to stop it. He looked at Emily. You're not going into that storm alone, Captain. I don't care what the rulebook says about the final phase. I don't care who outranks me. I will burn every favor I've saved in 30 years of service, and if that's not enough, I'll burn my career, and if that's not enough, I'll stand on that range myself with my own two eyes on you the whole time. Because 40 years ago, I stayed quiet, and 41 men your father saved don't even know his name. That ends here. That ends with you. Emily looked at him, and for a moment she couldn't speak because it had been a very long time since anyone had stood up for her like that, since anyone had looked at her and seen not a woman to be doubted, but a soldier to be defended. Thank you, she said finally. Don't thank me yet, Reeves said, and it was almost exactly what Garza had said on the first night, and the echo of it went straight through Emily's chest. Thank me when it's over. When you finish that phase and your father's got his medal, and the men who did this are in front of a board. Then you can thank me. Until then, we've got work to do and 36 hours to do it in, and an enemy in the dark who thinks he's already won. He looked around the room at the four of them. This strange alliance that had formed out of nothing, a captain. Nobody wanted a chief who'd seen too much, a master sergeant who'd been burned before, and a commander with a 40-year debt to pay. So let's go find out who he is, Reeves said, before that storm hits. And outside, far out over the Pacific, the storm they were all racing turned slowly toward the coast, vast and patient and indifferent, carrying in its dark heart the moment that would decide everything. The moment when the lights would fail and the optics would fog and the machines would die. And one woman with her father's rifle and her father's teaching would have to stand alone in the dark and shoot her way to the truth. She cleaned the rifle that night the way she always did, blind, in the dark. Her fingers moving on their own, each piece coming apart and finding its place, the notch in the honey-colored stock passing under her thumb, the mark she finally understood now, the ridge, the 11 hours, the 41 men. And as she worked, she found she wasn't afraid. Somewhere in the last 3 days, between the bus and the broken scope and the key in her locker and the file on Reeves' desk, the fear had left her completely. Let them come, she thought, snapping the rifle together with a series of soft, final clicks. Let them bring their storm. The rifle doesn't care who's laughing, and it doesn't care who's hiding in the dark either. It made sense on paper. Mitchell had motive. Mitchell had opportunity. Mitchell had hated Emily Carter from the second she stepped off that bus, and Mitchell had gone to the director trying to get her scores investigated. So Garza and Hendricks put their heads together and built a case against Ryan Mitchell. And it was a good case, and it was wrong, and they didn't figure out it was wrong until Hendricks pulled Mitchell's access records and found the hole in it. He couldn't have done it, she said, dropping the printout on Reeves' desk at just past midnight. Not the file part. Mitchell's a range animal. He's got competition, access, weapons, access, sure. But William Carter's personnel file, that's an Army archive. Restricted. You need clearance. Mitchell doesn't have and never will. Somebody pulled that file before you did, Commander. Somebody was reading about her father days before she even arrived. And it wasn't Mitchell, because Mitchell couldn't get within a mile of it. Reeves went cold. Somebody accessed the file before me, 3 days before, and then again the day after you did. Hendricks tapped the paper. Whoever it is they're watching your requests, they knew you pulled the file. That's how they knew to plant your name on Pruitt's phone. They saw you moving toward the truth, and they got ahead of you. And that was the moment the shape of the thing changed for all of them. Because Mitchell was a bully with a grudge, but a bully with a grudge doesn't have Army archive clearance, doesn't monitor a commander's file requests, doesn't reach 40 years into the past to weaponize a dead man's buried metal. The person they were hunting sat somewhere very high, somewhere with reach into systems most officers on that base didn't even know existed. And Mitchell was just the loud, angry face they'd been meant to look at while the real enemy worked in the dark. We've been staring at the decoy, Garza said slowly. The whole time. Mitchell's a distraction. A good one. Loud enough that we never look past him. Then we stop looking at Mitchell, Emily said, and we start looking at who has the clearance to pull that file. Reeves rubbed his face. That's a short list, and it's a list that includes men I've served with for 20 years. Men I'd have vouched for with my life yesterday. He looked up. You understand what you're asking me to do, Captain? You're asking me to suspect my own. I'm asking you to read the wind, Commander, Emily said quietly. Same as I do. You don't get to pick where it's blowing from. You just have to be honest about what you feel. Reeves was silent a long moment. Then he pulled a legal pad toward him and started writing names, and there were 5 of them. And he stared at those 5 names like they were 5 landmines because one of them had tried to bury a hero twice, and he'd shaken all their hands. 6 hours down, 30 to go. The next morning, the storm announced itself. Not with rain, not yet, but with a shift in the light and a change in the wind that Emily felt on the back of her neck the second she stepped outside, and she stopped on the walkway and turned her face into it and read it the way her father had taught her, and what she read made her frown. It's early, she said to Garza, who'd fallen into step beside her, out of habit, now a big man shadowing a small one across the base. The system's ahead of schedule. Weather command's calling 36 hours. It's going to be here in less than 24. Garza squinted at the sky, which to him looked like nothing at all. You can feel that off a breeze. My father could feel a front coming a full day out. Used to drive my mother crazy. He'd be closing the barn and she'd say the radio called for clear, and he'd just point at the sky and say the radio's not standing where I'm standing. Emily started walking again. The storm's coming early, Chief, which means whatever they've got planned, they've got less time to set it up than they think. And so do we. That afternoon, the fight Hendricks had predicted happened exactly the way she'd predicted it, quietly in the paperwork where nobody was supposed to be looking. The lane assignments for the final phase were posted, and Reeves had put his own man, a range officer named Staff Sergeant Delgado, on Emily's lane. Delgado was straight, careful, and personally loyal to Reeves, and having him standing beside Emily in that storm was the single most important protection they'd been able to arrange. And within 2 hours of the assignments going up, they changed. Delgado was reassigned to Lane 9 on the far side of the complex, and Emily's lane officer was now a name none of them recognized. A Sergeant Boykin, transferred in for the competition, records thin, background thinner. They moved Delgado, Hendricks said, and her voice was flat with fury. The second we put a man we trust next to her, they moved him. That's not a coincidence, Commander. That's them watching us in real time. They know exactly what we're doing, and they're countering it, move for move. Who has the authority to override my lane assignments? Reeves demanded. Hendricks handed him the change order, and Reeves looked at the signature at the bottom, the authorizing officer, the man with the rank to move Reeves' own assignment, and his face went slack, and then it went gray, and Emily watched all the color drain out of a commander who'd faced things most men couldn't imagine, and she knew before he said the name that the name was going to be bad. Colonel Hartman, Reeves said. The room went dead quiet. Frank Hartman ran this competition for 6 years, Reeves said, and his voice had gone strange and far away. He's the deputy director. He's been in my chain since I made lieutenant commander. He wrote my last 2 evaluations. He came to my daughter's wedding. Reeves set the change order down very slowly, like it might go off. And his name's on the list. He's got Army archive clearance from a joint assignment in the 90s. He's got authority over lane assignments, equipment, logistics, and competition records. He knew you were coming, Mikitin, because he sees every roster before it's finalized. And he just moved my man off your lane. You think it's him? Emily said. I think Reeves said carefully that I would have bet my life yesterday that it wasn't. And I think that's exactly what a man like Frank Hartman would count on. And there it was, the twist that turned Emily's stomach cold, because the enemy wasn't just above them. In the chain, the enemy was the man who'd shaped Reeves' whole career. The mentor, the trusted hand sitting at the very top of the pyramid, moving pieces with the casual authority of a man who'd never once been questioned. But a question hung over all of it, jagged and unanswered, and Emily was the one who asked it. Why, she said, a colonel, a deputy director, a man with a career and a reputation and nothing to gain. Why would a man like that care whether I finish a shooting competition? Why would he reach 40 years back to bury my father again? What does Frank Hartman have to lose from Emily Carter putting rounds on a target? And nobody in that room had an answer, because it made no sense. A grudge made sense for Mitchell. Money made sense for Pruitt. But a colonel destroying his own reputation, risking everything to stop a captain from finishing a competition and to keep a dead sniper buried, that was a man protecting something. And they didn't know what. We're missing a piece, Emily said. A big one. Hartman's not doing this because he hates women or because he doesn't like my scores. He's doing this because I'm a threat to something specific, and it's tied to my father, or it's tied to that file, or it's tied to both. There's a reason my father's medal disappeared. Commander, you said it disappeared, not denied. Somebody made it disappear. Somebody 40 years ago made sure William Carter never got recognized. She looked at Reeves. What if the person who buried it then is the same person trying to keep it buried now? Reeves stared at her. Hartman would have been a junior officer in '69, barely more than a kid. Junior officers file paperwork, Hendricks said slowly. Junior officers move files. Junior officers are exactly who you'd need to make a recommendation disappear. She looked around the room. What if Emily's right? What if this isn't about the competition at all? What if the competition's just where it came to a head? Because for the first time in 40 years, William Carter's name landed on a base where the man who buried him still had power, and a commander started pulling the thread. The silence in that room was total. If that's true, so, Reeves said quietly, then Frank Hartman didn't just bury a hero. He spent 40 years making sure the burial held. And Captain Carter walking onto his range with her father's rifle wasn't a competition to him. It was a resurrection. It was the one thing he'd spent his whole career making sure would never happen. He looked at Emily and something like horror moved across his face. You're not a marksman to him, Captain. You're a ghost. You're the past coming back to end him. And a man like that won't stop at a broken scope. A man like that will do whatever it takes. 18 hours to the storm. They needed proof, and they needed it fast, and the only lead they had was 40 years old and living in Arizona. The runner. The 81-year-old man who'd resupplied William Carter on that ridge and had never stopped telling the story. Reeves had his name and a phone number from the file, and he made the call himself on a landline in his office, with Emily sitting across from him, unable to breathe. The old man's name was Walter Briggs, and when Reeves explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a long silence on the line, and then Walter Briggs began to cry. I've been waiting 40 years for this phone call, Briggs said, his voice cracking and thin over the line. 40 years. I told everybody who'd listen. I wrote letters. I wrote to congressmen, to the army, to anybody I could think of. Bill Carter held that ridge with the world coming down on him, and he sent me back down the hill twice to keep the wounded moving, and I told him I wouldn't leave him. And he grabbed me by the collar and said, Walter, you get those boys out. That's the mission. I'll hold, and he held. Briggs was sobbing now. 41 men. I counted every one of them coming down off that valley. 41. And they gave that man a form letter. I've carried it my whole life. Is Bill still? He passed 6 years ago, Reeves said gently. And the old man on the other end made a sound that broke every heart in that room. But his daughter's here, Reeves said. Captain Emily Carter. She's a Marine Navy. She's a sniper. Mr. Briggs, best I've ever seen. She shoots her father's rifle, and we're trying to get him his medal. 40 years late, but we're trying, and we need your help. Emily took the phone. Her hands were shaking. Mr. Briggs, she said, my father never told me. Not once. Not in 30 years. I found out 3 days ago from a file. Of course he didn't tell you, Briggs said softly. Men like your daddy never do. The ones who did the least talk the most. The ones who did the most, like Bill, they can't talk about it at all, because talking about it means going back up that hill, and they spend the rest of their lives trying to come down. He paused. That notch on the rifle. Does it still have the notch? Emily went completely still. What did you say? The notch on the stock, just above the trigger. He cut it that night on the ridge with his bayonet in the dark when the last of the wounded were clear. I saw him do it. I asked him what it was for, and he wouldn't say. Is it still? It's still there, Emily whispered. I've touched it 10,000 times. I never knew what it was. Tears were running freely down her face now, and she didn't wipe them. What was it, Mr. Briggs? What did it mean? And Walter Briggs, 81 years old, told her. There were 42 of us went up that valley, he said. 41 wounded, and your daddy, and 41 came down. He cut that notch for the one who didn't. A kid named Reyes took a round before Bill ever got to the ridge, gone before the fight even started. Your daddy couldn't save him, and he blamed himself for it every day of his life, that one boy, even though there was nothing on God's earth he could have done. So he cut a notch, one notch, not for the 41 he saved, for the one he lost. Briggs' voice broke. That's the kind of man your father was, Emily. 41 lives, and the only mark he made was for the one he couldn't hold on to. Emily could not speak. She sat in that chair with the phone pressed to her ear, and 40 years of her father's silence rearranging itself in her chest every quiet dinner, every faraway look. Every night he'd strip that rifle in the dark and run his thumb over that notch, and never ever said why. And she understood now. She understood the box he never opened and the look he never lost. He hadn't been carrying a medal he never got. He'd been carrying a boy he couldn't save. "Mr. Briggs," she said when she could finally talk, "will you give a statement, a sworn statement, everything you just told me, everything you saw on that ridge?" "I've been trying to give that statement for 40 years, Walter Briggs said. "Nobody would take it. You send me whatever you need, young lady. I'll sign it in my own blood if that's what it takes. I'll fly out there. I'll stand in front of anybody. Your daddy held the line for me. It's about time somebody held it for him." Reeves took the phone back and made the arrangements a sworn statement, notarized in Arizona witnesses, everything documented, everything airtight. And when he hung up the phone, the four of them sat in that office in silence for a long moment because they'd started this trying to win a competition, and somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely, something that reached back 40 years and touched a boy named Reyes on a ridge nobody remembered. And then Reeves said the thing that snapped them back to the present. "If Hartman buried that recommendation in '69, he said slowly, then Walter Briggs's statement doesn't just get your father his medal, it's evidence of a crime. Hartman's crime. Because somebody had to physically separate that recommendation from the sworn statements, and if we can put Hartman's hands on that file 40 years ago, we can prove he did it." He looked up, "Which means the same statement that honors your father convicts the man who buried him. And Hartman knows it. That's why he's fighting so hard. It was never about you at all, Captain. You were just the match. Your father's file is the bomb. 14 hours to the storm. They had a theory now and a witness and a motive that finally made the whole terrible picture make sense. What they didn't have was proof that Frank Hartman had touched that file in 1969, and they didn't have proof he'd ordered the sabotage in the present. And without one of those two things, they had nothing they could bring to a board but a story. A true story. But stories don't relieve colonels of command. And they were out of time because the storm was coming early and the final phase was coming with it, and Sergeant Boykin was still assigned to Emily's lane. "We can't prove Hartman touched the file in '69, Hendricks said. "The record's that old, if they're not already destroyed, they're in an archive in St. Louis, and it'll take months to pull them. We don't have months. We've got 14 hours. "Then we get him in the present," Garza said. "Pruitt." They all looked at him. "Pruitt gave us a fake text with Reeves' name on it," Garza said, working it out fast. "But Pruitt's a witness, and Pruitt's scared, and Pruitt's been sitting at his post for a day and a half sweating himself sick. He told us Reeves gave him the orders. That was a lie, we know that. Now somebody fed him that name. But somebody real gave Pruitt those orders. Somebody handed him that scope and told him when to plant that key. Pruitt met with a real person, a real human being, and it wasn't Reeves." Garza stood up. "So I go back to Pruitt, and this time I don't ask him who gave the orders. I ask him to describe the man, height, build, face. Because whoever it was, Pruitt saw him, and Pruitt can pick him out of a photo. And if Pruitt describes Hartman," Reeves said, "or picks him out of a lineup that's a witness, putting a colonel at the scene of the sabotage, that's real." "That's real," Garza agreed. That's the crack we need." But when Garza got to Pruitt's post, Pruitt was gone. Not on a break. Gone. His station was empty, his gear was cleared out, and the duty log showed him signed out 4 hours ago on emergency leave, family emergency approved and processed, and stamped all of it. Clean all of it fast, all of it authorized by the deputy director's office. Hartman had moved him. The one witness who could describe the real man behind the sabotage, and Hartman had shipped him off the base on emergency leave before Garza could get a description out of him. "He's cleaning house," Hendricks said when Garza came back with the news, and her voice was tight. "He knows we squeezed Pruitt once and he's not giving us a second bite. Pruitt's gone. Delgado's reassigned. Boykin's on Emily's lane. He's setting the board exactly the way he wants it for the storm." She looked at Reeves. "Commander, he is 10 steps ahead of us on every single move, and we are running out of moves. 11 hours to the storm." And that was the moment Emily Carter stopped playing defense. She'd been reacting for 3 days. Reacting to the scope, reacting to the theft, reacting to the key, reacting to the frame, reacting to every move Hartman made from the shadows. And she was tired of it. Her father hadn't held a ridge for 11 hours by reacting. He'd held it by making the enemy come to him on ground he'd chosen. "We've been trying to beat him in the paperwork," Emily said. "In his world, records and clearances and lane assignments, that's his ground. He's been playing that game for 40 years, and we've been playing it for 3 days. We're never going to beat Frank Hartman at being Frank Hartman." She stood up. "So we stop. We stop trying to outmaneuver him in the shadows, and we make him come out into the light." "How?" Reeves said. "He wants me not to finish the final phase," Emily said. "That's his whole game now. He's built everything around the storm, around isolating me around Boykin on my lane, and no witnesses and chaos. His entire plan depends on me being alone and vulnerable out there in the dark." She looked around the room, and there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before, something like her father on that ridge. "So I give him exactly what he wants. I go out there alone. I let him make his move, and I make sure that when he does, there's a witness he doesn't know about standing exactly where he can't see." The room went still. "You want to bait him," Garza said slowly. "I want to bait him," Emily said. "He's careful. He's clean. He's never once put his own hands on anything. Pruitt Mitchell Boykin, he works through tools always because tools can be moved and silenced and shipped off on emergency leave. The only way we ever catch Frank Hartman is if we make him reach out and touch it himself. And the only thing that would make a man that careful take that risk is fear. Real fear. The fear that if this shooter finishes this phase, his 40-year secret comes out." She looked at Reeves. "So we make him believe that finishing this phase is exactly what blows him open. We make him believe I've got the proof, or I'm about to have it, and the only way to stop it is to stop me personally out there in the storm where he thinks nobody's watching." "That's insanely dangerous," Hendricks said. "You're talking about putting yourself alone on a range in a storm with his man Boykin and daring a desperate colonel to come after you personally. If it goes wrong, Captain, you don't fail a competition. You get hurt, or worse." "I know what I'm talking about," Emily said quietly. "I've thought about it from every angle. And here's what I keep coming back to." She turned to face all of them. "My father stood on a ridge for 11 hours knowing every one of them might be his last because 41 men were counting on him. I've got 4 people in this room and a boy named Reyes on the stock of my rifle and a witness in Arizona who's been waiting 40 years and one chance to end this before it buries all of us. Frank Hartman thinks the storm is his weapon. It's not, it's mine. It's the one place on earth where I have every advantage and he has none because when the optics fog and the computers die and the lights go out, I'm the only one who can still see." She picked up her father's rifle case. "He's spent 40 years in the dark. Let's find out how he does when I bring him into it." There was a long silence, and then Reeves stood up, and he looked at Emily Carter for a long moment, and Emily could see him weighing it, the danger against the necessity, the risk to her against the certainty that Hartman would win if they did nothing. "If we do this," Reeves said finally, "we do it my way with every safeguard I can build in. You're bait, but you're not alone, not really. I'll have eyes on that lane that Hartman doesn't know about. If he makes a move, we catch it, and we catch him, and it's over." He looked at her hard. "But if it goes past a certain line, if it turns into a danger to your life, we pull the plug. Competition be damned. Metal be damned, and I get you off that range. Are we clear? Your safety comes before all of it. Before the win, before your father, before everything. If your father saved 41 men, I am not going to be the man who let his daughter die proving it. Are we clear, Captain?" Emily looked at him. This commander who 40 years ago had stayed silent and had carried it ever since, and she understood that his fury at Hartman and his fierce protectiveness of her were the same thing, the same 40-year-old wound finally getting a chance to heal. "We're clear, Commander," she said. 9 hours to the storm. They built the trap in the dark, all 4 of them, and it was elegant, and it was simple, and it turned on a single lie. They would let it be known, through channels they knew Hartman was watching, that Emily Carter had obtained a sworn statement from a Vietnam-era witness, a statement that named the officer responsible for suppressing William Carter's Medal of Honor, and that she intended to submit it along with a formal complaint about the sabotage. immediately after completing the final phase. It was mostly true. That was what made it deadly. The statement was real. Walter Briggs was real. The only lie was the part that mattered most, that the statement named the officer. Because Walter Briggs couldn't name anyone. Walter Briggs had been on a ridge in a jungle. He'd never seen who moved the paperwork in some office 1,000 miles away. But Hartman didn't know that. Hartman only knew that a witness existed and a statement existed, and his 40-year-old crime was about to walk into the light, and the only thing standing between him and exposure was one shooter finishing one phase. Make him believe finishing the phase is the end of him, Emily had said, and then watch what a cornered man does. They fed the lie into the channels they knew Hartman monitored, a careful word here, a document request there, breadcrumbs a watching man couldn't miss. And then they waited and they watched Hartman's response, and it came within 2 hours and it confirmed everything. Because Sergeant Boykin, Emily's assigned lane officer for the final phase, requested and received access to the range's emergency systems, the fail-safes, the safety overrides that were supposed to protect a shooter if something went wrong in the storm. Boykin now had the authority to disable them. On Emily's lane, during the phase, in conditions where a disabled safety system could turn an accident into a fatality, and nobody would ever be able to prove it was anything but the weather. There it is, Hendricks said grimly, staring at the access log. That's the move. Boykin kills the safeties on her lane, and in that storm with no comms and no visibility, anything can happen to a shooter. A weapon malfunction, a fall from the elevated position, exposure, and every safety system that would have caught it or recorded it is offline, authorized on the books, all perfectly legal. She looked up. Hartman's not going to shoot her commander. He's too smart for that. He's going to arrange for the storm to do it, and the disabled safeties are how he makes sure it works. Then we've got him, Garza said. That access request. That's Boykin reaching for the murder weapon. That's Boykin, Reeves has said, not Hartman. Boykin's just another Pruitt, another tool. That access request buries Boykin. It doesn't touch Hartman. Hartman's fingerprints aren't on anything, they never are. That's the whole point of the man. He shook his head. We're back where we started. We can catch the tool. We can't catch the hand. And Emily, who had been quiet, listening, watching the pieces move, finally spoke. Then we make Hartman be the hand, she said. One time, just once. We make the situation so critical, so out of his control, that he can't trust a tool to handle it. We make him come out from behind Boykin and Pruitt and Mitchell and touch it himself because the stakes are too high to leave to anybody else. She looked at Reeves. The lie about the statement, it's not enough that he wants to stop me. We have to make him believe that Boykin's going to fail, that the safeties trick won't work, that the only way to make sure I don't finish and submit that statement is for him to intervene personally, directly at the last moment. We have to break his faith in his own plan so completely that he panics and does the one thing he's never done in 40 years. Comes out of the shadows, Reeves said slowly. Comes out of the shadows, Emily said. And when he does, you're standing there, with eyes he doesn't know about, and a recording he doesn't know about, and the whole thing lit up so bright he can't hide from it. We don't catch Frank Hartman by being smarter than him in the dark. We catch him by dragging him into the light and making him blink. The room was silent for a long moment. And then Garza, big, quiet Garza, laughed that low, genuine laugh and shook his head in something like wonder. You know what you are, Captain, he said. You're your daddy on that ridge. You're not running from the fight. You're picking the ground and making the enemy come to you across open country where you've got every gun zeroed. He stood up. God help Frank Hartman. He thinks he's hunting a woman who cries and quits. He's got no idea he's walking up a hill toward a Carter. 6 hours to the storm. The wind had picked up hard now, and the first fat drops of rain were starting to fall. And out over the desert, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the whole base felt it, that particular electric stillness that comes before something breaks. The shooters were making their final preparations, fussing over their optics, sealing their electronics, running last checks on ballistic computers that half of them knew in their hearts weren't going to survive what was coming. And in the middle of all that nervous motion, Captain Emily Carter sat alone on the edge of her cot and cleaned her father's rifle one last time, blind. Blind in the dark, her fingers moving on their own. And when she came to the notch, she stopped and she held her thumb against it, and this time she knew. A boy named Reyes, the one her father couldn't save. 40 years of silence carved into old wood. "Okay, Daddy," she said quietly, to the rifle, to the notch, to the boy, to all of it. "You held your ridge. Now I'll hold mine." She snapped the rifle together with a series of soft final clicks, and she stood up and she walked toward the door and out into the rising wind. And across the base, in a warm, dry office with a window that looked out on the darkening range, Colonel Frank Hartman stood with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the storm come in. And on his desk sat a report someone had quietly placed there. An hour before, a report that said Captain Emily Carter had obtained a sworn statement naming the officer who'd suppressed a Medal of Honor recommendation in 1969. A report that meant 40 years of careful, patient burial was about to be undone by one woman with her father's rifle. Hartman read it a second time, and a third, and his hands clasped behind his back tightened until the knuckles went white. He'd built a whole life on top of that grave. A career, a reputation, a colonel's rank in a deputy directorship, and a place of honor in a system that had never once thought to look beneath him. And it had all rested, the entire 40-year edifice of it, on the simple fact that William Carter had stayed buried, that the truth had stayed down, that no one had ever come to dig, ever. And now the man's daughter had walked onto his range with the rifle and the bloodline and the aim, and she'd survived the scope and the theft and the frame, and she was about to walk out into a storm and finish the one phase that stood between her and submitting the proof that would end him. Boykin would handle it. That was the plan. Kill the safeties, let the storm do the rest. But as Frank Hartman stood at that window and watched the sky come apart, a cold worm of doubt turned over in his gut, because Boykin was a tool and tools failed. And this woman had beaten every tool he'd thrown at her, every single one. And if Boykin failed too, if she came off that range alive with that statement in her hand, then 40 years of Frank Hartman ended in a board of inquiry in a cell. He could not leave it to Boykin. Not this, not the one thing that mattered. For the first time in 40 years, Frank Hartman reached for his coat. And out on the range in the rising dark, with the rain beginning to fall in earnest and the wind screaming across the desert in the long, invisible ropes. She'd been reading her whole life. Captain Emily Carter took her position on lane 14 alone, exactly as she'd planned, and waited for the man to come up the hill. The storm came down like the sky had finally given up, holding itself together, and Sergeant Boykin, standing on lane 14 with the rain running off his cover and sheets, keyed his radio and got nothing but static, exactly as planned, because in this weather the comms were dead and no one could hear a single word said on that range, which was the whole point, which was why Emily Carter had chosen it. "Captain," Boykin said, leaning close so she'd hear him over the wind, "conditions are getting bad. If you want to abort, no shame in it. Nobody'd blame you. Half these shooters are already washing out. Say the word and I'll call it." "I'm not aborting, Sergeant," Emily said, not looking at him, checking her rifle by feel the way she always did. "Your funeral," Boykin muttered, and Emily heard it and filed it away, that word funeral, because a man who says funeral over a woman with a rifle is a man thinking about one. What Boykin didn't know, what Hartman didn't know, was that 40 yards back, invisible in the driving rain, tucked into a maintenance alcove, with a clear line of sight to lane 14, 3 people were watching. Reeves, Garza, and Hendricks. And Hendricks had it a camera that could see in the dark, a thermal unit that cut through rain like it wasn't there, and it was recording, and it had been recording since Boykin took his position. Every word the wind swallowed they'd have on tape. Every move a man made in the dark thinking no one could see they'd have. "Safeties are offline," Hendricks murmured, watching her screen. "Boykin killed them 2 minutes ago. Confirmed. He's got the overrides pulled on her lane." She looked at Reeves. "If anything happens to her out there now, there's nothing to stop it and nothing to record it but us. We are the only safety left." "Then we don't take our eyes off her," Reeves said. "Not for 1 second. 90 minutes into the phase, Emily started shooting. And the storm that had crippled every other shooter on that range meant nothing to her at all. The first target came up at 400 yards, a strobe of a shape, in the rain, visible for 3 seconds, and then gone, and every shooter running optics was blind, their glass fogged and streaming, their laser ranges bouncing off the rain and coming back garbage. And Emily Carter looked through her father's iron sights at a target she could barely see, and she felt the wind on the left side of her face, and she read it. 40 years of a jungle and a hilltop in Montana, and 10,000 nights in the dark, all coming together in one exhale, and she pressed the trigger. And down the line on lane 9, Staff Sergeant Delgado, The man Hartman had reassigned to get him away from Emily watched his own screen go white with mom and cursed and wiped it and got nothing and thought there is no way anybody is hitting anything in this. The second target, Emily fired. Center. The third, Emily fired. Center. Boykin, standing beside her, watched her shoot targets he couldn't even see, and a cold feeling crept up the back of his neck because he'd been told this woman was good. But he hadn't been told she could stand in a storm that had every operator on the range fighting blind and simply reach out and touch each target like the weather was doing her a favor. And Boykin, who had a job to do, who had orders, began to understand that the storm wasn't going to stop Emily Carter, that the storm was Emily Carter's friend, and that whatever was supposed to happen out here was going to have to be made to happen because it wasn't happening on its own. He keyed his dead radio again. Nothing. He was on his own out here, cut off with a shooter who wouldn't quit and orders that were curdling in his stomach. 2 hours in and Frank Hartman arrived on the range. He came in a rain slicker with no rank showing, moving along the back of the lanes where the range officers wouldn't question a figure in the dark, and he made his way toward lane 14 through a storm so thick that men 3 feet apart couldn't recognize each other. And every step he took was a step out of 40 years of shadow, and he didn't even feel it happening. Hendricks saw him first, on the thermal. "Contact," she breathed. Single figure moving up the back of the lanes headed for 14. He's not a range officer. He's not in the pattern. He's coming straight for her. She adjusted the camera. "Commander, it's a full-grown man moving with purpose in a storm toward the one lane where the safeties are dead, and he's alone." Reeves stared at the thermal image, at the heat signature of a man moving through the dark toward Emily Carter, and every muscle in his body wanted to run out there and put himself between them. "Is it him?" he said. "Is it Hartman?" "Can't confirm from the heat," Hendricks said. "But look how he moves. That's not a young man. That's not Boykin's build. That's an older man who knows this range moving like he owns it." She kept the camera locked on. "Commander, if that's Hartman, if he came out here himself, then Emily was right about all of it. She broke his nerve. She dragged him into the open, but that means he's here to finish it personally. And that means she is in more danger right now than she has been this entire time." "Hold," Reeves said, and it cost him everything to say it. "We hold until we have him. If we move now, we've got a man in a raincoat and nothing else. We need him to reach her. We need him to do something or say something that puts it beyond doubt. And the second it turns into a threat to her life, we go. Garza, you're first out. You don't wait for my word. If she's in danger, you go." "I've been ready to go for 3 days," Garza said, low-coiled. Out on lane 14, Emily fired again and hit again, and did not know yet that the man she'd baited was 30 yards behind her and closing. But Boykin knew. Boykin saw the figure come out of the rain, saw the raincoat with no rank, saw the way the range officers parted around him without a word, and Boykin understood immediately who it was because only one man on this base moved like that. Only one man had that kind of silent authority, and Sergeant Boykin felt the bottom drop out of his stomach because the deputy director had just walked onto his lane in the middle of a storm, and that could only mean one thing. The plan had changed. The plan had escalated to the level where the colonel himself had come to see it done. "Sir," Boykin said. When Hartman reached him, the two of them huddled close in the screaming wind where Emily, focused downrange, couldn't hear. "Sir, what are you doing out here if anybody sees you?" "Nobody sees anything in this," Hartman said. "That's the beauty of it. How's she doing?" Boykin hesitated, and in that hesitation was the truth, and Hartman read it. "She's hitting everything," Boykin said finally. "Sir, I've never seen anything like it. The storm doesn't touch her. Iron sights, no computer, and she's putting rounds in the black on targets I can't even see. The safeties are off like you wanted, but sir, nothing's happening. There's no malfunction. There's no accident. She's just out here shooting clean through the worst storm I've ever seen, and when this phase ends, she's going to have the top score, and there's not a thing the weather's going to do about it." And that was the moment Frank Hartman's 40-year plan died in his hands, because he'd built everything on the storm. The storm was going to do the work. The storm was going to make it look like an accident, a malfunction, a tragedy. And Frank Hartman was going to stand at a memorial service with a grave face and go home clean, the way he always went home clean. But the storm wasn't cooperating. The storm had picked a side, and it wasn't his. And now the woman was going to finish, and she was going to submit that statement, and 40 years of buried truth was going to come up out of the ground with her name on it. Then the storm's not going to be enough, Hartman said very quietly. Boykin went still. Sir, you heard me, Sergeant. Sir, the safeties are off. That's one thing that's deniable, but you're talking about Boykin couldn't even say it. That's a captain, a U.S. captain, on a live range. I'm talking about an accident, Hartman said, and his voice had gone flat and cold and 40 years deep. In a storm, on a range with no safeties and no comms and no visibility. The kind of thing that happens, Sergeant. The kind of tragedy that happens when a stubborn shooter refuses to abort in dangerous conditions. That's all. Nobody's talking about anything else. He looked at Boykin. You've come this far. You planted the scope. You moved the ammunition. You killed the safeties. You're in it up to your neck already, son, and there's no version of tonight where you walk away clean unless it ends the way it needs to end. So you're going to help me make sure this stubborn captain has her accident, and then it's over. For both of us. 40 yards back, Hendrix's thermal camera caught two figures now close together, and the audio, a directional mic she'd aimed the second Hartman appeared, caught the wind and caught the static and caught in broken fragments through the storm words. Accident storm, no safeties. That's a captain. Help me make sure. Hendrix's blood went to ice. Commander, she said, and her voice was not steady. We've got it. We've got him. That's a confession. He's telling Boykin to kill her and make it look like an accident, and it's on tape. She looked up and her face was white. But Commander, we've got it, and that means it's happening. That means right now, out there, that man is about to go, Reeves said. Garza, go now, go. And Garza was already gone, but already up and out of the alcove and running full out into the storm. A big man moving faster than a big man should be able to move 40 yards of open range between him and lane 14, 40 yards of driving rain and screaming wind and darkness. And out on lane 14, Emily Carter fired her last shot of the string and hit and lowered the rifle. And in the sudden quiet between rounds, she heard something behind her that the wind almost swallowed. A word, her name, not shouted, said, low and cold and close. Captain Carter. She turned, and Frank Hartman was standing 3 feet away, rain streaming off a slicker with no rank, and behind him Boykin. And in that instant, Emily understood that the trap had worked, that she dragged the man all the way out into the open, and that the open was also where he could reach her, and that she was alone on a range with the deputy director and his tool, and the safeties dead, and the comms silent, and no witnesses in the whole storm-blind world. Except she wasn't alone. She just had to hold the ridge long enough for the man running toward her to arrive. Colonel Hartman, Emily said, and she kept her voice steady, and she kept her father's rifle in her hands, and she did the thing her father had done for 11 hours on a hill in a jungle. She held. I wondered when you'd finally come out where I could see you. Hartman went very still. You know who I am. I know exactly who you are, Emily said. I know you pulled my father's file before I even got here. I know you've had archive clearance since the 90s. I know you're the one who moved Delgado and shipped Pruitt off on emergency leave and put your man Boykin on my lane and killed the safeties. She took a slow breath. And I know you're the one who buried my father's Medal of Honor 40 years ago. You were a junior officer. You handled the paperwork. You separated the recommendation from the sworn statements, and you made a hero disappear. And you've spent 40 years making sure he stayed disappeared, haven't you, Colonel? Hartman's face in the rain and the dark did something Emily would remember for the rest of her life. It broke open. Just for a second, 40 years of a mask slipping, and underneath it something old and rotten and afraid. You can't prove any of that, he said. Maybe not the part from 69, Emily said. Not yet. But I've got a witness, Colonel. Walter Briggs, 81 years old in Arizona, been trying to tell my father's story for 40 years. And now somebody's finally listening. And Walter's going to sign a statement, and that statement reopens the recommendation. And reopening the recommendation means people start asking who buried it. And that thread comes back to you. It always comes back to you. She held his eyes. That's why you're standing in a storm right now, isn't it? Because a dead man's daughter picked up his rifle and you couldn't let her finish. Because if I finish, the truth comes up out of the ground and 40 years of Frank Hartman ends. You should have aborted, Hartman said quietly, when Boykin gave you the chance. That was your out. Stubborn conditions, dangerous storm. You called it off and went home, and none of this had to happen. He shook his head slowly. But you didn't. You stayed. And now we're all out here in the dark where anything can happen, and there's no comms, and there's no safeties, and there's no one to see. You made this bed, Captain. You wouldn't quit. No, Emily said. I wouldn't. It runs in the family. And she saw at the moment the shift in Hartman's shoulders, the decision arriving in a man who'd come too far to go back, and she braced, and she thought, come on, Chief, come on. And she prepared to hold the ridge with the only thing she had, which was her father's rifle and 40 years of refusing to quit. And Boykin moved, not toward Emily. That was the thing nobody expected, the thing Hartman least expected, the twist that turned the whole night. Boykin moved, but he moved between Hartman and Emily, and he put himself there, a young sergeant with rain running down his face and a conscience that had finally, at the last possible second, refused to break. No, sir, Boykin said, and his voice shook, but he didn't move. No, I killed the safeties. God help me, I did that, and I'll answer for it. But I'm not doing this. I'm not helping you hurt a captain on a live range. I joined the Navy. I didn't join you. He was breathing hard. You want to do this, you do it yourself. But you're going to have to come through me, and I'm going to be a witness, and I'm done being your tool. And Frank Hartman stared at the sergeant who'd just betrayed him, and 40 years of a man who'd never once had to get his own hands dirty came apart in the rain, and Hartman did the thing that finally completely damned him. He reached for Boykin to move him, to throw him aside, his hand closing on the younger man's jacket with a violence that gave up every pretense of accident, of storm of tragedy. And in that instant, Frank Hartman stopped being a colonel giving orders and became a man committing a crime with his own two hands, which is exactly when Garza hit him. 240 pounds of chief petty officer came out of the storm at a dead run and took Frank Hartman off his feet and put him down on the wet range with an impact that drove the air out of the colonel's lungs. And then Garza was on top of him, pinning him a knee in his back, and both wrists locked, and Garza's voice in his ear was the calmest, most terrible thing Emily had ever heard. Colonel Frank Hartman, Garza said, you are under arrest, and every word you just said is on tape, every single one. So you go ahead and lie in the Board of Inquiry the way you've been lying for 40 years. It won't matter. We've got you saying it in your own voice. It's over. It was over the second you stepped out of the shadow. She brought you out. She's been bringing you out since the day she stepped off that bus, and you were too arrogant to see it. Hartman thrashed once, twice, and then went still, because there was no fighting Garza's weight, and there was no fighting the truth, and 40 years of Frank Hartman ended face down in the rain on a range in the middle of a storm, arrested by a chief petty officer, witnessed by the sergeant. He'd tried to make his tool in front of the daughter of the man he'd buried. And Reeves and Hendricks came out of the storm at a run. Hendricks with the camera still recording Reeves with a face like a coming reckoning, and Reeves stood over the man who'd shaped his whole career, the mentor who'd come to his daughter's wedding and looked down at him with 40 years of buried fury. Frank, Reeves said, my God, Frank, it was you the whole time. The story I heard as a lieutenant, the sniper who held the ridge, the hero the system erased, it was you that erased him. You, and I spent 40 years thinking the system did it, thinking it was nobody, thinking it was just a machine. His voice cracked. It was never the machine. It was a man. It was you. Hartman, face down in the rain, said nothing. Get him up, Reeves said. Get him up and get him off my range. And read him his rights, every one of them, because Frank Hartman is going to get exactly what he denied William Carter for 40 years. He's going to get his day in front of people who look at the truth. And this time the paperwork's going to say exactly what happened. They got him up, and they took him off the range. And Boykin went with them because Boykin had killed the safeties and Boykin would answer for it. But Boykin had also refused at the last second to become a murderer and had put his own body between a captain and a colonel. And that was going to count in the end for something. And Emily Carter stood alone on lane 14 in the driving rain, her father's rifle in her hands, and watched them lead Frank Hartman away into the storm, and felt 40 years lift off her shoulders that she hadn't even known she'd been carrying. But the phase wasn't over. That was the thing Emily understood standing there in the rain watching the others go. The trap had worked. Hartman was caught, just as 40 years late was finally turning. But the competition wasn't done, and the string wasn't complete, and there were targets left to shoot. And Emily Carter had not come all this way, had not endured the scope and the theft and the frame and the storm, and a colonel's hands reaching for her in the dark to leave the ridge before the mission was finished. Captain Reeves called back through the rain, having handed Hartman off to the security detail that had come running once the comms flickered back. "It's over. We've got him. You can stand down. You don't have to finish. You've done more than anyone could ever." "Yes, I do," Emily said. "I do have to finish, Commander." She turned back down range into the storm and raised her father's rifle. "He tried to stop me from finishing. Him and Mitchell and Pruitt and the whole machine, 40 years of it. And the only way that this ends right is if I finish. If I stand on this ridge and I complete the mission the way my father completed his. Not for the competition, not for a score." Her voice dropped and the rain took most of it, but Reeves heard. For him, for the boy on the stock, for Walter Briggs waiting 40 years. "I finished the string, and then it's done." And Reeves, who understood, said nothing more. He just stepped back out of the lane and he watched, and Garza came and stood beside him, and Hendricks and even Boykin, held by security, but watching, and the whole soaked, storm-battered group of them stood in the rain and watched Captain Emily Carter finish what her father started. The targets came up, strobing shapes in the driving rain, visible for seconds, gone in an instant, in conditions that had blinded every operator on the range and destroyed $100,000 of optics and computers, and turned the best marksmen in the United States military into men fumbling in the dark. And Emily Carter read the wind with the side of her face and looked through the iron sights her father had aimed through in a jungle 40 years before, and at the bottom of a long exhale, she pressed the trigger. Center. She cycled the bolt by hand, smooth and unhurried rain streaming off the old blued steel. Center. Again and again and again, every target, every shot. In the worst storm anyone on that base had ever shot, in blind alone, with no computer and no scope and nothing but a bare hand and a lifetime of a dead man's teaching, Emily Carter put every single round in the black. And when the last target fell and the last shot echoed away into the storm and the string was complete, she lowered the rifle, and for a long moment she just stood there in the rain, breathing her father's rifle warm in her hands despite the cold. The notch under her thumb, the boy named Reyes. The 41 men, the 11 hours, the whole long-buried weight of it finally set down. "Mission complete, Daddy," he whispered, and the storm took it and carried it up into the dark, where maybe somewhere a man who'd held a ridge for 11 hours could hear. Behind her in the rain, Chief Garza took off his cover. Just took it off bareheaded in the storm, the way men do without deciding to. And then Reeves did the same. And Hendricks. And Delgado, who'd come down from Lane 9 to see what the impossible looked like. And one by one, up and down that storm-blind range as word spread. In the way word spreads, the shooters who'd mocked her off the bus and doubted her at the line and watched her do the impossible for 4 days straight. They took off their covers too, bareheaded in the rain for a captain. Nobody had wanted who'd just outshot every one of them in a storm that should have been impossible, with a rifle older than most of them, carrying a legacy none of them had known was there. Emily didn't see it right away. She was still turned downrange, still breathing, still coming down off the ridge. And when she finally turned around and saw them, all of them bareheaded in the driving rain, standing in silent salute to her and to the man whose rifle she carried, something in her chest that had been locked tight for 6 years, for a whole career, for a whole life, finally broke open, and she let it. And the rain hid the tears the way the storm hides everything. And she stood there and let these men, these hard, doubting, humbled men, honor her father through her. Kowalski was the first to speak. He walked up through the rain, bareheaded, and he stopped in front of her, and his voice was thick. "Captain," he said, "that's the finest shooting I've ever seen, or ever will." He swallowed. "And I'm sorry, for the bus, for all of it. I didn't know who I was talking to." He glanced down at the rifle. "I didn't know who he was either, but I'd have been proud to serve under him. And I'm proud to have stood on the same range as you." Emily couldn't speak. She just nodded and put her hand on Kowalski's shoulder, and that was enough, and Kowalski understood and stepped back. But it wasn't quite over, because Frank Hartman was in custody, but Ryan Mitchell was still out there, and Mitchell had made a phone call 2 days ago to a man who'd told him to hold his nerve, and Mitchell had chosen himself, and Mitchell was about to learn what that choice had cost. They found him in the assembly hall, dry waiting out the storm with the shooters who'd aborted, and when Reeves walked in soaked to the bone with Garza beside him and told the room that Colonel Frank Hartman had been arrested on the range for attempting to arrange the death of a competitor, the color drained out of Ryan Mitchell's face so fast that half the men in the room turned to look at him on instinct because guilt has a smell, and Mitchell reeked of it. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Reeves said, and the whole room went quiet. "We've got Hartman on tape, every word. And we've got Pruitt's statement and Boykin's, and both of them put you in the middle of it. The scope, the theft, the complaint to the director designed to discredit her scores." He crossed the room slowly. "You were his tool, same as Pruitt, same as Boykin. And you had a chance 2 days ago to walk into the director's office and tell the truth and take your medicine. And you didn't. You chose yourself. You always choose yourself." Reeves stopped in front of him. "Well, here's the truth, Lieutenant. Boykin, who did worse than you, put his body between Hartman and that captain when it mattered. He broke at the last second the right way. And you never broke at all. You just hid, and you hoped, and you let a colonel try to kill a woman rather than risk your precious reputation." Reeves' voice was pure contempt. "You're relieved. You're under investigation. And whatever a board decides, you're going to carry this for the rest of your life. Because you had a choice, and Boykin had the same choice, and he chose to be a man, and you chose to be a coward. Get out of my sight." And Ryan Mitchell, 3-year champion Golden Boy, the best shooter on the base, stood up in front of every man who'd ever admired him and walked out of that hall with his reputation in ashes. And not one person watched him go with anything but disgust, because there is nothing that the men on a range respect less than a man who lets someone else fight his fights and won't even fight his own. Emily wasn't there for it. Emily was still on the range in the rain, with her father's rifle being led at last toward shelter by Hendricks, who had an arm around her. Now the two women who had shaken hands in a dark barracks 4 nights ago walking off the ridge together. "You did it," Hendricks said quietly. "You brought him out. You finished the string. You did the whole thing." "We did it," Emily said. "I wasn't alone. Not for 1 minute of it. That's the only reason it worked." She looked at Hendricks. "You know, when I stepped off that bus, I thought I was going to have to do this the way I've done everything, alone, the only one in the room, and instead," her voice caught, "instead, I got you, and Garza, and Reeves. I got people who stood on the ridge with me." She shook her head, rain streaming down her face. "My father held his alone. 11 hours alone. I keep thinking about that. He never had this. He never had people come out of the storm for him." She stopped walking. "I got to have what he never got, Master Sergeant. And I think that might be the thing that finally lets me set it down." Hendricks didn't say anything. She just tightened her arm around Emily's shoulders, and the two of them walked off the range together out of the storm toward the light. And in a warm, dry office, Commander David Reeves sat down at his desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and picked up a pen and began to write the report that would end Frank Hartman and vindicate Emily Carter. And finally, 40 years late, tell the truth about a sniper who held a ridge for 11 hours so that 41 men could go home. But the report on Hartman was only half of it, because there was another document to prepare now, and it was the one Reeves had been waiting his whole career to write without ever knowing it. The reopened recommendation. The Medal of Honor for Staff Sergeant William Carter, United States Army, for actions on a ridge in Vietnam in March of 1969, supported by the sworn statement of Walter Briggs, witnessed by the daughter who'd carried his rifle into a storm and out the other side. Reeves looked at the blank page for a long moment, and then he began to write, and outside the storm began, at last, to break the clouds, pulling apart in the east, where the first gray light of morning was starting to come. And somewhere in Arizona, an old man named Walter Briggs was sitting by his phone, waiting the way he'd waited for 40 years, and this time the call was going to come. The call came at 6:14 the next morning, and Walter Briggs answered it on the first ring because he'd been sitting by that phone all night. "Mr. Briggs," Reeves said, "it's Commander Reeves again. I'm calling to tell you it's done. The recommendations reopen. Your statements going in this morning notarized, witnessed the whole thing. And I've got a colonel in custody who's going to answer for what he did to Bill Carter 40 years ago." Reeves paused and his voice went rough. "You waited 40 years to be heard, sir. You are heard now. Every word." There was silence on the line, And then the old man made a sound low and broken, 40 years of grief and helplessness and refusing to let go, all coming out at once. And he said, "He held the line for us, Commander. Bill held the line, and I never stopped holding it for him, not once, not in 40 years. He was crying openly now. And now his little girl's holding it too. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? That's how the line stays held. Somebody always picks it up." "Yes, sir," Reeves said. "That's exactly how it works." Emily was in the room. She'd asked to be there for the call, and Reeves had put it on speaker, and now she sat with her hand pressed over her mouth, listening to an 81-year-old man weep for her father. And she understood that she wasn't the only one who'd been carrying William Carter all these years. Walter Briggs had carried him too. A whole valley of men had carried him. Her father had never been as alone as he'd believed. He just never knew it. "Mr. Briggs," Emily said. "This is Emily Carter, Bill's daughter." The old man went quiet. "Emily Wiono," he said like he was tasting the name. "Bill's girl. Lord, you sound just like him. That flat calm, that's him all over." A pause. "Did you finish? The commander told me you were shooting a competition. Did you finish it?" "I finished it, Mr. Briggs," Emily said. "In the worst storm you ever saw. Iron sights, every target. I put every round in the black." And Walter Briggs laughed through his tears, a wet, delighted, disbelieving laugh, and he said, "Course you did. Course you did. That's a Carter. Held the line in the storm. Just like your daddy." He was quiet a moment. "You know what he'd say if he could see you? He wouldn't say a word. He'd just look at you, that look he had, and you'd know. That was Bill. He never said much, but you always knew." "I know," Emily whispered. "I always knew." 6 weeks later, the Board of Inquiry convened, and it was not the kind of proceeding that got buried. Colonel Frank Hartman sat at the defense table with a lawyer and a face carved out of stone, and he had denied everything exactly as he'd denied everything for 40 years. And it did not matter even a little because Hendrix's thermal camera had caught every word he'd said on that storm-blind range. His own voice telling Boykin to arrange an accident, telling him a captain could have a tragedy in a storm with no one to see. There is no lawyer alive who can talk his way around a man's own voice saying that. And Boykin testified. He'd made a deal, and the deal was that he'd tell the whole truth, every piece of it, and in exchange the fact that he'd refused at the last second that he'd put his own body between Hartman and Emily Carter would be weighed in his favor. And Boykin told it all. The scope, the stolen ammunition, the missing range cards, the key planted in Emily's locker. The fake text with Reeves' name on it that Hartman had orchestrated to blow up the one man who could vindicate William Carter. And finally, the safeties killed on Emily's lane and Hartman's own words in the storm. Why did the board president ask Boykin, "Why did you do all of it and then refuse at the very end?" And Boykin, 26 years old, his career in ruins no matter what happened, looked at the board and said the truest thing he had ever said in his life. "Because up until that last second, sir, I told myself it wasn't real. A broken scope, some missing ammo, a key in a locker, I told myself it was just messing with her. Just making her quit. I never let myself see what it actually was." He swallowed. And then he stood there in the rain and said the word accident, and I saw her standing there with that old rifle having just shot the best string I'd ever seen in a storm that beat everybody else. And I understood that I was about to help murder a woman who was better than all of us. And I couldn't. That's all. I just couldn't. He looked down. "I did wrong, sir. I'll carry it forever. But I'm not sorry I stopped. It's the one thing I did out there I'm not sorry for." And the board took note of it, and in the end, Boykin was punished, but he was not destroyed because he'd broken the right way at the last moment, and because a young man who chooses to become a witness instead of a murderer with a colonel's boot on his neck is a young man worth something still. Ryan Mitchell did not get off so easy. Mitchell had never broken at all. That was the thing the board could not forgive. He'd known for 2 days that a colonel was orchestrating the destruction of a fellow officer, and he'd said nothing, and he'd hoped it would all go away and leave his reputation intact. And when it came out that his contribution had been driven by nothing nobler than wounded pride, that he'd hated Emily Carter simply because she'd threatened his standing as the best shooter on the base, the board looked at him the way the shooters had looked at him walking out of that assembly hall, with disgust. Mitchell was discharged, not honorably. His name came off the trophies. His 3 years of titles were struck from the record. And he walked out of the military the way he'd walked through it alone, thinking about himself, and no one, not one single person, came to see him off. And Frank Hartman was convicted. He was convicted of attempted murder, of conspiracy, of obstruction, of everything they could prove, and a good deal that he'd done that they couldn't, and he went to prison, a colonel, a deputy director, a man who'd come to Reeves' daughter's wedding, and the system he'd used for 40 years to bury a hero turned at last and buried him instead. And when they read the sentence, Frank Hartman did not break, did not weep, did not show anything at all, because Frank Hartman had spent 40 years perfecting the art of showing nothing, and he took that skill with him into the cell where he would die. But before they took him away, Emily Carter did something no one expected. She asked to speak to him. They put them in a room, a guard at the door, Hartman in restraints, and Emily sat across from the man who tried to have her killed, who'd buried her father twice, and for a long moment she just looked at him. "I'm not here to gloat," she said finally, "and I'm not here to forgive you because I can't and I won't pretend I can. I'm here because I want you to understand one thing before they take you away." She leaned forward. "You buried my father in 1969 because you thought he didn't matter. A sniper, a nobody, a man who'd be easy to erase. And you spent 40 years making sure he stayed erased because his existence was a threat to yours." She held his eyes. "But here's what you never understood, Colonel. You can bury a man. You cannot bury what he was. My father held a ridge for 11 hours and saved 41 men, and you took away the medal, but you could not take away the ridge. You could not take away the 11 hours. You could not take away the 41 men who went home and had children and grandchildren, a whole river of life that exists because one man wouldn't leave his post. You buried the paper. You never touched the truth." She sat back. "And the truth raised his daughter, and his daughter walked onto your range and outshot every man you had and dragged you out of the shadow you'd been hiding in for 40 years with his rifle in a storm on iron sights. You didn't just fail to bury him, Colonel. You resurrected him. You made his story bigger than it ever would have been if you'd just left it alone. That's your legacy. You spent 40 years and your entire life trying to erase William Carter, and all you did was carve his name deeper. Sit with that." And Frank Hartman, for the first and only time, broke. Not much. A flicker. A crack in the stone. But Emily saw it, and it was enough, and she stood up and walked out and did not look back because she'd said what she came to say, and there was nothing left in that room worth another second of her life. The Medal of Honor was awarded to Staff Sergeant William Carter, United States Army, 7 months later. It was awarded posthumously in a ceremony at the White House, and the citation was read aloud, the whole of it, the ridge and the 11 hours and the 41 men and the resupply runs, and the single sniper who held the line alone until every wounded man was clear. And it was read by name into the record in front of cameras and dignitaries in a color guard 41 years after it happened, and 6 years after the man himself had died, and there was no footnote this time. No lost paperwork, no burial. This time the truth stood up in the light and was heard. Emily Carter accepted it on her father's behalf. She stood at the podium in her dress uniform, and behind her sat Walter Briggs, 82, now flown in first class at the Army's expense in a wheelchair with an oxygen line and a chest full of his own faded ribbons, weeping openly and not caring who saw. And beside Briggs sat Reeves and Garza and Hendricks, the 3 people who'd come out of the storm for her, and further back in a section reserved for them, sat a dozen old men and their families, gray and stooped and trembling. The survivors and the sons and grandsons of the 41 men who'd come down off that valley alive. 41 men, and here were their descendants, a whole hall of life, breathing and living and existing, because one sniper on one ridge had refused to leave his post. Emily looked out at them, and for a moment she couldn't speak, and the hall waited, and she gathered herself the way her father had taught her, in and out long, and even until her heartbeat was the only clock in the room. "My father never told me," she began, "not once in 30 years. I found out what he did from a file 3 days before I understood who he really was. He came home from Vietnam with this rifle," and she touched the case beside the podium, "the old M14 brought here for this, allowed here for this, and a box he never opened, and a look in his eye he never lost. And he taught me to shoot before he taught me to ride a bike. He said the world would try to take things from me because of what I am. But he said nobody could take a straight line between me and a target if I earned it fair." She paused. I understand now that he was talking about more than shooting. He was talking about his whole life because the world did try to take everything from him. It took his recognition. It took his medal. It took 40 years of an honored name and gave him a form letter instead. But it could not take the one thing that mattered. She looked out at the descendants of the 41. It could not take what he did. Every one of you in that section is proof. Every child, every grandchild, every life in this room that exists because of that ridge. That's my father's real medal. This, she lifted the actual medal, the blue ribbon, the gold star catching the light. This is beautiful and it's 40 years late, and I will treasure it. But this was always the smaller honor. The larger one was you. The larger one was that you're here at all, that you got to be born, that you got to live. The hall was silent, and then it was not because people had begun to cry, all of them, the dignitaries and the color guard and the reporters who were supposed to stay neutral, and in the back the old men who'd been boys on that ridge held onto each other and wept for the friend who'd held the line. There's a notch on this rifle, Emily said, and her voice was breaking now, and she let it. My father cut it that night on the ridge in the dark with his bayonet. I touched it 10,000 times growing up, and I never knew what it was. I found out from Walter Briggs, who's sitting right there, who watched him cut it. She looked back at the old man, and Briggs nodded, tears streaming. It's not for the 41 he saved. My father never marked those. It's for the one he lost. A boy named Reyes gone before the fight even started, before my father could reach him. One notch, for the one he couldn't hold on to. Her voice dropped almost to nothing. That was my father. 41 lives, and the only mark he made was for the one he couldn't save. He carried that boy for the rest of his life. He carried him in silence, and he carried him alone, and he never once let any of us see the weight of it. She lifted her head. So this medal is for the 41, and it's for Reyes. And it's for a man who did the greatest thing a person can do, and then came home and asked for nothing and got less than nothing and never complained, not once, not in 30 years, because he didn't do it for a medal. He did it because 41 men were counting on him, and a Carter doesn't leave the ridge. She stood up straight, and she was her father in that moment. Everyone in the hall could see it, the same flat calm, the same steel. Staff Sergeant William Carter held his line. For 11 hours alone in the dark, he held it. And I have spent my whole life trying to be worthy of the man who taught me how. Today, finally, his country holds the line for him. It's 41 years late. Her voice rang out clear and final across the silent hall. But the line is held, and it will stay held, because that's what we do. Somebody always picks it up. And the hall came to its feet. All of them, every soul in that room, rose as one and stood in silence for a dead sniper who'd been buried twice and resurrected by his daughter. And the applause, when it finally came, was not really applause at all. It was something older and deeper than that. It was a whole room of people holding the line. Emily found Walter Briggs afterward in a quiet corner, away from the cameras, and she knelt down beside his wheelchair and took the old man's trembling hand. You did this, she told him. 40 years you wouldn't let it go. Every letter, every congressman, every person who wouldn't listen. If you'd given up even once, there'd have been no witness, no statement, no proof. Hartman would have won. My father would still be buried. She squeezed his hand. You held the line too, Mr. Briggs. All these years alone with nobody listening, you held it. You never left your post either. Walter Briggs looked at her with eyes that had seen a jungle and a ridge and 40 years of silence, and he said, he'd be so proud of you, Emily. You know that, not for the shooting. Bill never cared about the shooting the way people thought. He'd be proud of the other thing, the not quitting, the holding on. That's what he'd be proud of. He patted her hand. You brought him home, girl. 60 years I've carried that ridge, and you brought all of us home. Emily stayed with the old men a long time that day, the boys who'd come down off the valley, and she listened to their stories and she let them tell her about her father in a way he'd never told her himself. And by the end of it, she understood him better than she had in 30 years of living in his house. The silence, the faraway look, the box he never opened. It all made sense now, and it wasn't a wall anymore. It was a wound, and it had finally been allowed to heal. She went back to serving, of course. Emily Carter was not the kind to rest on a single triumph, and there were more ridges to hold more lines that needed keeping. But she carried the medal in a small case now tucked in her gear beside her father's rifle, And on the hard nights, the ones where she was the only one in the room, again, the only one who looked like her facing down another Mitchell or another broken scope, she'd take it out and hold it. And she'd run her thumb over the notch on the old M14, the boy named Reyes, and she'd remember. She'd remember that her father held a ridge alone for 11 hours and never got to see justice done. And she'd remember that she hadn't been alone, that Garza had come out of the storm, that Hendricks had put her arm around her shoulders, that Reeves had burned for 40 years of a friendship to drag the truth into the light, that an old man in Arizona had never once let go, that a young sergeant had broken the right way at the last second and put his own body in the path of a colonel's crime. Her father held his ridge alone. Emily never had to, and she understood in the end that this was the gift he'd given her without even knowing it. He'd taught her to hold the line, and the world this time had taught her that she didn't have to hold it by herself. Chief Garza retired 2 years later, and at his retirement ceremony, he asked Emily to speak, and she did. And she told the room the story of a woman who stepped off a bus into a crowd of men who laughed at her, and a chief who sat up in a dark barracks and decided for no reason except that it was right to stand with her. He told me not to thank him, Emily said, looking at Garza across the room. He said, "Thank me when it's over, if either of us is still standing." She smiled. "Well, Chief, it's over, and we're both still standing. So thank you for coming out of the storm." Hendricks made Master Chief the highest an enlisted sailor can climb, and at her promotion, Emily pinned the anchor on her one woman who'd been told to make coffee for 4 years. Lifting up another, the two of them who'd shaken hands in a dark barracks, now standing in the light. And neither of them said much because they didn't have to, because that was the kind of understanding that didn't need words. And Reeves, before he retired, made it his final mission to go back through the old files, the buried recommendations, the lost paperwork. 40 years of men, Frank Hartman and men like Frank Hartman had erased, and he found other heroes the machine had swallowed, and he dragged them one by one into the light, and by the time he hung up his uniform for the last time, he'd corrected 11 injustices that everyone else had decided were too old to matter. "I stayed quiet once," he told Emily on his last day. 40 years ago when I was young and it was easy to stay quiet, and I carried it my whole life. Your father and your fight gave me the chance to stop carrying it, to do the thing I should have done at the start." He shook her hand. "You didn't just get your father his medal, Captain. You woke me up. And a lot of other men are going to get what they earned because of it. That's the thing about holding the line. It doesn't stop with you, it spreads." And it did spread. Walter Briggs lived to see it lived, another 3 years long enough to attend 2 more posthumous ceremonies for men. Reeves pulled out of the dark, sitting in his wheelchair in the front row, each time weeping, each time a one-man honor guard for every hero the machine had tried to forget. And when Walter Briggs finally passed at 85, Emily Carter stood at his funeral in her dress uniform and rendered a salute so sharp and so long that the whole gathering fell silent watching it because they understood they were watching one line holder honor another. Years passed. Emily Carter's own career became a kind of legend. The captain who'd outshot the best in a storm on iron sights, the daughter who'd resurrected a hero, and young shooters women especially came to her the way they come to anyone who has walked through fire first and proven the path can be walked. And she told them all the same thing her father had told her, the thing that had turned out to be about so much more than shooting. "The world's going to try to take things from you," she'd say, "because of what you are. It'll doubt you and mock you and hand you a broken scope with your name on it. And you can't always stop that. But there is one thing they can never take, not ever if you earn it fair. A straight line between you and the target." And then she'd add the part her father never got to say, the part she'd learned in a storm on a range with 3 people at her back and an old man on the phone. "And when it gets hard, when you're the only one in the room, hold the line anyway. But look around first, because you might not be as alone as you think. Somebody's usually there in the storm waiting to stand with you. And if there isn't," she'd smile, "then you be that person for the next one. That's how the line stays held. Somebody always picks it up." At the very end of her career, on the day she retired, Emily Carter did one last thing. She took her father's rifle, the old M14 blued steel, worn silver. The honey-colored stock cracked and repaired the notch cut in the dark by a bayonet for a boy named Reyes, and she donated it to a museum where it stands today behind glass beside the Medal of Honor citation, and a photograph of Staff Sergeant William Carter as a young man and beside a second smaller plaque that Emily insisted on. That reads simply, "He held the line." So did his daughter. Children walk past it every day. They press their faces to the glass and look at the old rifle and read the words, and most of them don't understand yet, and someday some of them will. Someday one of them will step off a bus into a crowd that laughs and face down a broken scope with their name on it and remember an old rifle behind glass and the words beside it, and they'll understand. And they'll hold the line and they'll pick it up. Because that is the whole of it, the entire truth of William Carter and Emily Carter and Walter Briggs and every hero the machine ever tried to bury and everyone who refused to let them stay buried. You can take the medal. You can lose the paperwork. You can hide a man in the dark for 40 years and put a colonel's boot on the neck of the truth. But you cannot bury what a person was, and you cannot stop the line from being held because there is always somebody coming up behind who will pick it up and carry it forward. They laughed at Emily Carter when she stepped off that bus. They said she couldn't hit anything not like that, not without a scope, not with an old man's rifle in a young man's game. She held the line in the storm. She dragged the truth into the light. She brought her father home. And no one ever laughed again.